Imagine if the most powerful empire spanning half of Europe for 6 centuries had been built not through conquest and bloodshed, but through the simple act of marriage. Imagine that the greatest military power of the medieval and early modern world rose not because of brilliant generals or revolutionary tactics, but because one family understood something far more patient and far more peculiar, that you could rule by wedding. This is the story of how that happened. The light is failing now across a gallery in Vienna. It is the kind of golden hour that lingers just before true darkness, when the sun hangs at that angle that makes everything seem suspended in amber and memory. Oil lamps have been lit along the walls, not for electricity, but out of custom, out of the weight of centuries repeating the same gesture. Their flames are small and steady, and they cast moving shadows across the faces in the portraits that line this room. These are the Habsburgs. You can smell it here, not unpleasantly, but distinctly. The perfume of old oil paint, thick and slightly sweet where it has dried across canvas over hundreds of years. There is dust, of course, the kind of dust that settles on things that have survived longer than anyone expected them to. It hangs in the air, almost imperceptibly, floating through the light rays that slant through the tall windows, and underneath it all, there is silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a room full of watchers, canvas faces, arranged in careful compositions, their eyes following anyone who moves through this space. The floorboards creak beneath your feet, wood that has been walked across by emperors and courtiers, and, in later centuries, by tourists and scholars trying to understand what this family was, how they endured, and what the cost of their endurance truly meant. The walls are painted a deep cream, almost ivory, chosen long ago to make the paintings stand out. The gilt frames around each portrait catch what remains of the daylight in thin, golden lines. In one portrait, a man stares out with a jaw so pronounced it seems almost sculptural, as though his entire face has been pulled forward by some force not yet named. In another, a woman sits in layers of stiff fabric and jewelry, her expression composed, but her eyes holding something unreadable. And in another, a child, dressed in the heavy clothes of some distant century, their small face serious beyond their years. This gallery exists in Vienna because Vienna was, for half a millennium, the heart of something vast and strange, and ultimately fragile. The Habsburg dynasty ruled not just Austria, but at various points they held Spain, they held the Netherlands, they held territories across Europe and into the Americas. They collected crowns the way other families might collect land or gold, and they did it through a method that sounds almost quaint in its restraint. They married very carefully, very deliberately, and almost exclusively with one another. The question that brings us here, into this dusty gallery with its watching portraits, is this: how does a family become so vast and so powerful that half the royalty of Europe shares their blood? And perhaps more intriguingly, what happens to that power and to that blood when you marry only within the family across 600 years? This is a story about power, yes, but it is also a story about genetics and consequence, about the weight of tradition, about a family that may have married its way to the top of Europe only to discover that genes, unlike crowns, cannot be passed through strategy alone. If you find yourself drawn to the hidden histories of Europe's ruling dynasties, to the stories of how power actually worked behind the velvet curtains, of royal secrets written in blood and document, of empires that rose not through conquest, but through an almost bewildering understanding of marriage as geopolitics, then I invite you to subscribe, because we will explore together the long, slow decline and persistence of one of history's most remarkable families, the House of Habsburg. For now, the candles flicker, the portraits watch, and it is time to go back before Vienna, back before empires, to a small castle in Switzerland where all of this began. It is perhaps the year 1300, or somewhere near it. The world is feudal and fragmented, and full of small powers competing for advantage. No one knows yet that a family will rise from obscurity to reshape the entire structure of European power. No one imagines that 600 years from now, scholars will stand in galleries like this one, examining portraits, counting chins, trying to understand what happens when you pursue dynasty above all else. But that is what we are going to explore together, beginning now, in the fading light, with the story of how a family named Habsburg learned to rule through the simple, patient, ultimately tragic art of marrying very well. The castle is called the Habsburg Castle. It sits on a hill in the Aargau region, in what is now Switzerland. It is not large, it is not particularly remarkable. It is, in fact, quite modest. The kind of fortress that might have been built by any prosperous noble family of the medieval period, designed to provide defense and the appearance of power, but not grandeur. Not yet. Around this castle, the land rolls gently. It is the kind of landscape that seems almost ordinary now, but in the late medieval period, it represented something precious. Defensible position, good water access, proximity to important trade routes. The family that built this castle, we might as well call them what they would become known as, the Habsburgs, from the name of the castle itself, were ambitious, certainly, but they were not, at their origin, particularly powerful. They were regional nobles. They mattered in their locality. Yet something was understood by the members of this family, something that would guide their choices across generations. It was understood, perhaps, through observation, perhaps through reading the chronicles and histories of other families that had tried to expand through warfare and conquest, only to be broken by other warriors, other conquerors. Perhaps it was simple pragmatism, but the Habsburg family, in those early centuries, began to notice something that other noble families sometimes missed. You could accumulate power through marriage more reliably than through war. War is uncertain. Someone might defeat you. Alliances made on the battlefield can be broken. Territories won through conquest can be lost to the next ambitious neighbor. But marriage, if conducted strategically, if done carefully across generations, if built into a kind of system, marriage could tie territories together in ways that were harder to untangle. A daughter married to a neighboring prince meant that if something happened to his line, the Habsburg claim might extend into his lands. A son married to a wealthy heiress meant his children would inherit both his father's titles and her family's vast holdings. And if you repeated this again and again, with patience, with a kind of deliberate restraint about who married whom and why, well, you could build something extraordinary. This is what the Habsburgs discovered. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that this is what they decided to believe, and then to make true through the systematic application of strategy across centuries. They would not be the family that conquered Europe through armies, though they had armies. They would be the family that married into Europe, that wedded their way across a continent, that accumulated power through the slow, patient, ultimately strange practice of dynastic union. And the portraits in this gallery, the ones we saw in that fading light, they are the record of this choice. They are the faces of people who understood themselves as links in a chain. They are the painted evidence of a philosophy. Let others wage war. You, Habsburg, you marry. Within the vaults of Vienna's imperial archives, there exists a curious inscription, 5 letters, arranged in a way that seemed almost like a riddle, a secret encoded by a family that would come to reshape the map of Europe, not through conquest, but through something far more patient and intricate than the clash of swords. AEIOU. This is how the Habsburgs chose to announce themselves to history, and if you were to ask the scholars who have spent lifetimes studying this dynasty, they would tell you that these 5 vowels represent perhaps the most successful gamble in the history of European power. a motto that declared something almost counterintuitive. Archduca Austriae est imperare orbi universo, or in the gentler translation, Austria is destined to rule the whole world. But here is the peculiar thing. They did not rule it through the thundering charge of cavalry, through the strategic genius of military commanders, or through the conquest of distant lands. Instead, they ruled through an almost meditative art, the arrangement of marriages. Consider this for a moment. How does a family from a small region in what is now Switzerland come to command an empire so vast that maps had to be redrawn to contain it? How do the Habsburgs, whose ancestral holdings in the medieval period were modest, almost provincial compared to the great kingdoms of France and England, manage to place their children on thrones across half a continent? The answer lies not in the smoke and ash of battlefields, but in something quieter and somehow more durable: the deliberate, generation-spanning strategy of marrying into power rather than seizing it. This approach distinguished the Habsburgs from nearly every other dynasty of their era. Where the kings of France expanded their realm through military campaigns, where the rulers of England conquered and subdued through force of arms, where the Spanish monarchs sponsored explorations and planted flags in distant shores, the Habsburgs seemed to practice a different form of chess altogether. They moved their pieces across the board, not with the violence of a knight's charge, but with the patient precision of a bishop moving diagonally through space and time. Each marriage was a negotiation, each union of noble families a borderless expansion of influence. A son marries into Burgundy, and suddenly Habsburg holdings stretch further north. A daughter weds a Spanish prince, and suddenly the family's reach extends into Iberia and beyond. The pattern repeats across generations, each matrimonial bond another thread, woven into an increasingly elaborate tapestry of dynastic control. This was not cruelty, though the human cost was real. This was not always happiness, though occasionally love and duty aligned. Rather, it was the logical outcome of a simple question that the Habsburgs posed differently than other dynasties. Why wage war when you can marry? Why spend the treasury on armies when you can spend it on dowries? Why risk the sons and brothers who might otherwise inherit when you can instead arrange for their children to inherit kingdoms they would otherwise have no claim to whatsoever? The philosophy itself seems almost cynical when stated so plainly, yet it contains within it a recognition of something that medieval princes understood intuitively, that bloodlines carried a kind of currency that swords and shields, for all their glitter and weight, could never quite replicate. A king by conquest must always fear the next conqueror. A king by inheritance, by birth, by the accumulated recognition of bloodline and legitimacy, could rule with a confidence that no military commander, however brilliant, could manufacture. The Habsburgs grasped this truth so completely that they built an entire empire upon it. But the costs, accumulated silently across centuries, would become visible in the mirror and in the portrait gallery. As families marry within their own extended lineage, as cousins bear children to cousins, as the pool of possible spouses narrows and narrows until the available options are only those who share already significant portions of ancestry, something begins to happen at the level of blood itself. The very mechanism that granted them such unprecedented control over European politics would eventually begin to work against them, in ways that would not become fully apparent until several centuries had passed, until the portraits painted by court artists showed faces that carried the weight of genetic consequence, until the whispered doubts of physicians and the private fears of parents could no longer be dismissed as mere superstition or malice. Yet in these earlier centuries, as the dynasty was still rising, as the marriages were still being arranged with the optimism of people who believed they had discovered something like a perpetual motion machine of power, the cost was invisible, a debt that would be paid centuries later by descendants who would never know why they carried within them the accumulated weight of their ancestors' strategic ambitions. For now, in the medieval glow of castle halls and the careful negotiations of court diplomats, the Habsburgs stood at the threshold of something unprecedented. An empire built not on the foundations of conquest, but on the architecture of blood itself, and the mysterious mathematics of inheritance that seemed, for a glorious stretch of centuries, to defy all the logic of history and human nature. If you find yourself drawn into these intricate webs of dynasty and marriage, of crowns won not through conquest, but through the patient orchestration of unions across generations, then you might recognize in yourself a particular kind of curiosity, one that finds itself satisfied not by dramatic battles and sudden triumphs, but by the slow accumulation of power, the quiet mathematics of inheritance, the way a single bloodline can reshape the map of an entire continent simply by choosing whom to marry. There is something profound in that realization, something that speaks to how differently the world could have unfolded had a single ancestor made a different choice, had a single marriage never taken place. And if that possibility intrigues you, if you find yourself wondering what other secrets lie dormant in the halls of Europe's great royal houses, what other dynasties rose to impossible heights through mechanisms we have perhaps forgotten or never fully understood, then I would invite you to return for more journeys like this one. There will be others, long, winding explorations through the lives of the crowned and the courtly, through the hidden rooms where history's greatest decisions were made, not in war rooms or councils of state, but in chambers adorned with silk and candlelight, where two families came together and decided the fate of millions. Each story unfolds at its own pace, revealing not the triumphant narrative we often expect from history, but the human one beneath it, the personal costs of ambition, the physical toll of keeping bloodlines pure, the strange alchemy by which power transforms those who inherit it. Subscribe, if you wish, to follow these paths deeper into the European past, to understand how the great houses held their grip on civilization for centuries, and what it cost them to do so. But now, let us return to where our Habsburg story truly begins, in a place that seems almost impossibly modest for a dynasty that would one day rule half of Europe. Imagine the landscape of medieval Switzerland, a region of valleys and swift rivers, where feudal lords held small territories, and where the grand ambitions of empire seemed to belong to other, more celebrated houses. There, nestled in the Aargau region not far from the Rhine, stood a castle that would become the ancestral seat of the Habsburgs, the Habsburg Castle itself, its name derived from the High German words for hawk and slope, a modest stone fortress that bore no resemblance to the sprawling palaces we associate with later Habsburg glory. The name alone, repeated across generations, would eventually become synonymous with power and prestige, but in its earliest form, it was simply a stronghold, one among dozens in a landscape where such strongholds were common. The family that dwelt there, in these early medieval centuries, were not visibly destined for anything beyond regional importance. They were minor nobility, capable enough in the management of their lands, but lacking the obvious markers of future dominance. And yet there is something almost romantic in that obscurity, something that reminds us that even the greatest dynasties began in relative shadow, that power is not always announced at its inception but rather grows gradually, spreading like roots through soil, connecting to other bloodlines, other territories, other possibilities, until at last it becomes impossible to contain within the boundaries where it began. The story of the Habsburgs, like so many stories of power, begins not in a palace, but in a modest stone fortress perched on the banks of a river no one thinks to visit anymore. In the canton of Aargau, in what is now Switzerland, where the landscape rolls gently through vineyard and forest, stands the Habsburgburg, the castle of the house, a structure so unremarkable that it might pass unnoticed by anyone travelling through that region today. Yet from this small and ancient keep came a dynasty that would rule half of Europe for 6 centuries, commanding empires so vast that historians struggled to find words large enough to contain them. The question worth sitting with for a moment is this: how does one modest castle, in a region that would eventually cease to belong to any Habsburg heir at all, become the origin point of an empire? The answer lies not in military conquest, but in patience. The answer lies in what the Habsburgs had that so many other noble families lacked: not greater strength, but a far more subtle quality. They understood something that few of their contemporaries grasped: that marriage, when pursued with systematic discipline across generations, could accomplish what armies took decades to achieve. They understood that a woman married into a rival house was worth more than a soldier with a sword. When we speak of the medieval Habsburgs, we are not speaking of emperors yet, though that word would come. We are speaking of a family whose name itself derived from this single fortress, Habsburg, the Hawk's Castle, named for the hawks that circled the Swiss valleys long before any titled lord claimed dominion over them. The family emerged into history's view sometime in the late 10th century, though the exact chronology, as with so many things from that shadowed age, remains uncertain in the dim light of surviving documents. What we know is that by the early 12th century, the Habsburgs had begun to consolidate land and authority around their Aargau stronghold, accumulating territory, not through conquest alone, but through inheritance, through the careful marriages their ancestors arranged, through the patient, slow accumulation of rights and claims. The castle itself, when you imagine it as it must have been in those early centuries, was a fortress of stone and necessity. It rose from the landscape with thick walls designed to withstand siege, with chambers suited to cold winters and the constant readiness for attack. There were no grand halls yet, no vast galleries for royal ceremonies. There were rooms for storage and weapons, kitchens built to sustain a garrison, towers from which sentries could watch the river valleys below and the approaching roads. It was functional, austere, the dwelling of minor nobles whose ambitions extended beyond their immediate territories, but whose power did not yet. Think of what it would have sounded like inside those walls during the 13th century. The clatter of armored men, the heavy wooden doors opening and closing, horses in the courtyard, servants moving through stone corridors with torches held before them against the perpetual darkness of the interior. A family lived here with their household, their retainers, their servants, their ambitions. They looked outward from these walls and saw neighboring territories, saw opportunities, saw the slow unfolding of a Europe in constant flux. Around them, the medieval world was reorganizing itself. The old certainties were fracturing. The Holy Roman Empire existed as a kind of phantom authority, powerful in theory, but increasingly dependent on the particular strength and cunning of whoever held the imperial throne. The princes of the German lands jostled for position and advantage. The church wielded immense power, but was itself divided by competing claims and reformations. In such an age, a family with land, with modest wealth, with enough military capability to defend their territory, could aspire to something greater if they were willing to think strategically. The Habsburgs were willing. They were, in fact, extraordinarily willing. They seemed to possess an almost uncanny ability to read the currents of their time, to position themselves at moments of transition, to make the marriage that mattered or the alliance that held when others faltered. Historians have sometimes attributed this to luck, but it seems more accurate to describe it as a particular species of intelligence, the ability to see generations ahead and to shape small decisions in the present with a distant future in mind. The castle remained, even as the family's power grew and spread, even as they eventually left Aargau behind and established themselves in Austria, even as they became emperors, the castle stood. It became a symbol, a memory, the physical anchor to a simpler time before crowns and vast territories, Before the weight of empire settled on the family's shoulders, the name stuck, though they would later be associated with Vienna, with Schönbrunn, with palaces that made Habsburgburg seem like a hermitage. They remained the House of Habsburg, always carrying that reference back to the modest fortress on the Swiss river. And perhaps this is worth reflecting upon, that even the grandest empires often emerge from small beginnings, from a single castle, a single family, a decision made by ancestors whose names we would never remember if not for what came after. The early Habsburgs could not have imagined, standing in the courtyard of their Aargau fortress, that their descendants would marry into the thrones of Spain, the Netherlands, Hungary, Bohemia, and territories beyond counting. They could not have imagined that their name would become synonymous with European nobility itself, with a particular style of elegant formality that would endure even as their power crumbled. What they did possess was something more immediate and more practical. They possessed land that was defensible, resources that were adequate to their needs, and a strategic position at the confluence of important trade routes. They possessed, too, a kind of cunning attentiveness to the world around them, a willingness to adapt as circumstances changed, and they possessed something that not every noble family possessed in equal measure: the ability to think in terms of centuries rather than years, to plan marriages not for personal happiness but for dynastic advantage, to see their individual lives as merely moments in a far longer story that their children and their children's children would continue to write. From this modest castle, the slow expansion began, not with dramatic conquest, but with the careful movements of chess pieces across the map of Europe. A daughter married to an important prince, a son wed to a wealthy heiress, an inheritance claimed through a distant female relative. With each generation, the Habsburgs expanded their reach, pushed their influence further, acquired more titles and more territories, until they could plausibly claim a place among the most powerful families in all of Christendom. The castle remains. You can visit it if you ever find yourself in that corner of Switzerland where the landscape is gentle and the rivers are small and the past seems somehow closer than it does in busier places. It is not vast, it is not magnificent, it does not immediately inspire awe in the modern visitor, but it stands as a reminder of something worth remembering, that the greatest empires often begin in obscurity, that power is often built slowly through patient accumulation rather than dramatic conquest, and that a family in a modest castle can look outward at the world and see possibilities that others cannot yet imagine. In the middle of the 13th century, when much of Europe was still a patchwork of feudal squabbles and uncertain borders, there lived a man named Rudolf of Habsburg, a count of modest renown in what is now Switzerland, ruling from a castle that seemed almost swallowed by the Alps around it. He was not destined for greatness by the standards of his age. His lands were small, his lineage, while respectable, was far from the most prominent among the German nobility, yet something in him understood a truth that would reshape Europe, that patience, strategy, and the careful reading of other men's ambitions could accomplish what swords alone could not. The year was 1273. The German throne sat empty, a vacancy that had lasted for 2 decades, a wound in the body of what was meant to be the Holy Roman Empire. The princes and bishops and nobles of the fragmented German lands had grown weary of the struggle between competing factions, each backing their own candidate for the crown, each unwilling to see another's choice elevated. It was a stalemate born of exhaustion rather than strength. In such moments, history sometimes turns toward the unexpected candidate, the one who promises not dominion, but stability, compromise, an end to the endless circling. Rudolf was that man, though almost no one knew it yet. The electors, the archbishops and dukes whose voices truly mattered in the selection of a king, were searching for someone they could control, someone without vast territories that might give him independence. someone who might owe his throne entirely to their collective will. When they turned their attention to Rudolf, they saw exactly what they were looking for: a capable administrator, a man of word, someone who had built his small rule through negotiation rather than conquest. Here was a count who would be grateful for elevation, they reasoned. Here was someone who would remember who had lifted him up. What they did not anticipate was his hunger. Rudolf accepted the crown of Germany in 1273, and his first act was to begin moving slowly, methodically, like a hand tightening around an object in the darkness. He did not march into Austria with an army. He did not declare grand conquests or make sweeping proclamations that might have alarmed the very princes who had elected him. Instead, he began to marry strategically into the families of the Austrian nobility. He negotiated. He adjudicated disputes between rival lords with such fairness that they began to trust him. And when the opportunity came, when a weakened Bohemian king left his holdings vulnerable, Rudolf did what his electors had hoped he would not do. He took them. Austria had been a duchy, increasingly difficult to govern, increasingly contested among the noble houses that surrounded it. Its position between the German lands and the Hungarian plains made it strategically invaluable. To control Austria was to control the flow of trade, of influence, of power across Central Europe. And slowly, through a combination of military action and marriage alliance, Rudolf brought it under Habsburg rule. By the time he died in 1291, the family that had begun as modest Swiss counts had established themselves as the masters of one of the most important territories in the German lands. This is the moment, the hinge upon which the entire machinery of Habsburg power begins to turn. From this point forward, Austria became the Habsburg seat. Austria became the foundation upon which an empire of 6 centuries would be built. The small castle in the Aargau would fade in importance, its name remembered only by historians and genealogists, but the shadow it cast would lengthen and lengthen across the map of Europe until it covered half a continent. There is something almost dreamlike about how this happened, if you step back far enough to see the pattern. Rudolf did not conquer Austria as his predecessors had conquered lands, with the shock of cavalry and the finality of siege. He wove himself into its fabric. He married his children into its nobility. He made the duchy feel as though his rule was less an invasion than an inevitable outcome, a natural settling of the landscape into its proper form. The Austrian nobles, watching this slow integration, found themselves not subjugated but incorporated. The difference, subtle as it is, would prove crucial to Habsburg longevity. Consider what this required of Rudolf himself, a kind of patient intelligence that runs counter to the myths we often tell about medieval power. The romance of kingship in that era belonged to knights and conquerors, to men who seized glory through sudden, violent action. Yet here was a king who won through negotiation, through the careful arrangement of marriages, through the mastery of administrative detail. He understood something fundamental about how power actually works, beneath all the pageantry and poetry, that whoever controls the networks of obligation, kinship, and mutual interest controls the territory itself. His successors would inherit this understanding. They would build upon it. But it was Rudolf who first grasped that a dynasty need not be the strongest military power to be the most durable. It could instead be the most connected, the most patient, the most willing to think in terms of generations rather than seasons. The Habsburgs would never again be forced to scramble for legitimacy as Rudolf had scrambled. They had earned their foothold. They had become, through his efforts, a natural part of the landscape of Central Europe. And Austria, that duchy wedged between great powers, that territory that had seemed almost cursed by its own strategic importance, finally had found a ruling family that would not abandon it at the first sign of trouble or temptation. The Habsburgs would hold Austria for the next 646 years. The medieval world was a vast chessboard where the stakes were not merely territory or gold, but the very survival of a family's name across centuries. To understand how the Habsburgs came to rule so much of Europe without wielding the bloodiest sword, one must first grasp a paradox that shaped the entire arc of their rise: that marriage, in those distant centuries, was often far more powerful than warfare and far more enduring. A castle won by siege could be lost in the next generation to a rival's attack, but a daughter married into a neighboring realm, or a nephew wedded to a distant cousin's heiress, these bonds, fragile as they seemed, could bind kingdoms together in ways that no army ever could. In the centuries before the Habsburgs achieved their great prominence, the map of Europe was a fractured thing, divided into hundreds of petty kingdoms and principalities, each ruled by families locked in perpetual conflict. To conquer your neighbor's lands through battle was to invite counter-invasion, to bleed your treasury on soldiers and siege engines, to face the constant drain of maintaining an occupation among hostile peoples. But to marry into those lands, or to arrange for your heirs to inherit through blood and contract rather than conquest, that was a subtler art, one that required patience, long memory, and a willingness to think not of immediate advantage, but of advantage stretching decades, even centuries ahead. The medieval mind understood bloodline in a way that feels distant to us now. It was not merely sentimental or ceremonial, it was law. A woman who married into a kingdom carried with her the legitimate claim of her house, and any children born of that union inherited that claim. In a world where contested succession could tear a realm apart, this was currency more valuable than any amount of gold or iron. A clever ruler did not ask, "How can I conquer Burgundy?" Instead, he asked, "Which of Burgundy's daughters can my son marry, such that their children will inherit through lawful succession?" Consider how this logic rippled through generations. A single marriage in one year might seem almost invisible in the moment, just another ceremony in which a young person, often betrothed as a child and married in adolescence, left their native court for a foreign one. But that single marriage could plant the seed of a claim that would bloom a generation later, when an old duke died without sons, and the law of inheritance, guided by the marriage contract signed decades before, passed his kingdom to his daughter's children, who happened to be of the royal line that had arranged the marriage in the first place. The brilliance of this system, if one can call strategic patience brilliant, lay in its gradualism. Each generation of rulers could claim to be merely honoring the ancient contracts and blood ties of their ancestors. They were not aggressors, they were simply asserting what was rightfully theirs by law and kinship. And because these claims accumulated slowly, layering one upon another, by the time a rival realized the true scope of the expansion, it was already woven too deeply into the fabric of legitimacy to challenge without enormous cost. What made this strategy so effective for the Habsburgs in particular was their relative lack of scruples in pursuing it. While other dynasties might feel bound by tradition or regional loyalty to marry within a narrow circle, the Habsburgs cast their nets wider and seemed endlessly willing to forge marriages with almost any power that served their long-term interests. A marriage that brought wealth might be followed a generation later by one that brought military strength, followed by another that brought a crucial city or province. Over time, these connections created not just a single kingdom, but a latticework of overlapping claims, each one legitimate in its own right, but together forming something unprecedented. There was also, it bears noting, an element of calculation regarding the sheer economics of inheritance. Warfare was costly, and even a successful war meant you had conquered lands that were hostile, potentially restless, possibly damaged by the fighting itself. But inheriting through marriage meant acquiring territories peacefully, or at least legally. A vassal who became a vassal through marriage was arguably less likely to rebel than one who had been recently conquered. And more importantly, The conquered territories did not have to be garrisoned with expensive military forces, because no one was contesting the inheritance. The law was on your side. Yet it would be misleading to suggest that this reliance on marriage meant the Habsburgs were somehow more peaceful than their rivals. They still warred, still sieged cities, still bled their treasuries on armies. But they did so from a position of expanding legitimacy and accumulated claims, which meant each conflict was often shorter, more decisively won, and left them in a stronger position to consolidate through the next marriage. They had learned to weaponize legitimacy itself. The Church, too, played a quiet role in this arrangement. The Catholic hierarchy had every incentive to prefer marriage-based expansion over conquest-based expansion, because marriage involved contracts, oaths, and the sacrament of matrimony. These were things the Church could bless, record, and validate. A marriage between two Christian monarchs was an event of spiritual significance, not merely political calculation. And when disputes arose about the legitimacy of a claim, the Church was often the arbiter, a role that gave it power, but also meant it had incentives to find in favor of whichever claimant had the strongest marriage contracts and the most impressive network of ecclesiastical support. So what emerges in those long medieval centuries is a portrait of a fundamentally different kind of politics than what we might imagine when we think of dynasty and power. This was not a world of generals and battles alone, though those existed. This was a world in which the marriage brokers and the genealogists held as much influence as the military commanders. A court's historians kept elaborate records of every marriage, every child, every inheritance claim that had been granted or disputed, because these records were the basis of legitimacy itself. The Habsburgs, as you will come to see, became the masters of this game. They understood, perhaps more deeply than any other dynasty of their age, that time was their greatest ally. Where other rulers sought quick victories and immediate expansion, the Habsburgs thought in terms of generations and centuries. They married deliberately, contracted strategically, and allowed the slow accumulation of inheritance claims to do much of the work that armies would have otherwise had to accomplish. And in doing so, they set in motion a process that would transform a modest Swiss castle and a relatively minor family into the ruling house of half of Europe. In this sense, the real foundation of Habsburg power was not forged in a single moment of conquest or military genius. It was woven together, thread by thread, through hundreds of careful marriages, each one seemingly small at the time it was contracted, but each one adding weight and legitimacy to the family's claims. One might even say that the Habsburgs did not so much conquer Europe as gradually marry into it, a process so slow and deliberate that by the time their rivals truly grasped the scope of what was happening, it was far too late to stop. Through the 14th and 15th centuries, the Habsburg territories began to accumulate like autumn leaves, settling across the landscape of Europe, each union adding weight and substance to what had been a modest Alpine holding. Frederick III, who would rule for a staggering 53 years, understood something that earlier Habsburgs had perhaps only sensed, that the map of Europe was being redrawn not by pitched battles in muddy fields, but by the careful choreography of marriages arranged in candle-lit chambers, witnessed by notaries, sealed with wax and the signatures of the great. Frederick, called Frederick the Peaceful, was a peculiar figure in a martial age. His contemporaries often mocked his cautious nature, his apparent indecision, his preference for negotiation over the sword, and yet it was precisely this temperament that allowed him to see what others missed, that while kings bled away their treasuries and their sons in endless border disputes, the Habsburg line could expand its reach through the simple, bloodless mechanism of matrimonial alliance. He inherited Austria in 1439, and from that moment forward his reign became a patient accumulation of titles and territories through strategic marriage. Consider what was at stake in those unions. Burgundy was not merely a region of vineyards and modest towns nestled in what is now France and the Low Countries. It was a crossroads. It was wealth. It controlled trade routes that ran from the Mediterranean to the North Sea, channeling the commerce of nations through its halls and harbours. Burgundy had accumulated power during the long twilight of medieval French authority, and by the mid-15th century, it represented something close to independence, a quasi-kingdom in its own right, governed by a ducal family that had grown rich and ambitious. To the south and west lay Spain, then still a collection of competing kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, and Granada, where the last Muslim emirate in Western Europe clung to existence. Spain, too, was gathering itself into something larger, something more formidable, through the union of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469. That marriage, as history would eventually reveal, would reshape the world when Columbus sailed under their patronage 2 decades hence. But in Frederick's time, Spain was still seen primarily as a repository of ancient Christian authority and accumulated wealth from centuries of conquest and trade. How does a Swiss-born dynasty, one that had held Austria almost by chance, come to bind these vast regions into a single imperial whole? The answer lies in the painstaking work of Frederick III and his son Maximilian, who understood that the future belonged not to the conqueror, but to the matchmaker. Frederick's first crucial marriage was orchestrated in 1452 when he wed Eleanor of Portugal. It was a union that brought prestige and Portuguese connections to the Austrian line, establishing legitimacy among the royal houses of Western Europe. But it was Frederick's son Maximilian, born of this union in 1459, who would become the true architect of Habsburg greatness through matrimonial strategy. Maximilian would become the vehicle through which the medieval empire gave way to the modern one. The turning point came in 1477, when Mary of Burgundy, the immensely wealthy heiress to the Burgundian dukedom, found herself alone and vulnerable. Her father, Charles the Bold, died in battle that year, a kind of poetic irony that while Frederick pursued peace, his rivals still fell to war. Mary, young and in possession of vast territories and wealth, became the most sought-after marriage prospect in Europe. Kings and nobles circled like hawks, each sensing the prize she represented. Louis XI of France, always eager to expand his holdings, made a bid for her. Emperor Frederick III, aging and still calculating, proposed a union between Mary and his son Maximilian. Maximilian was in his late teens, untested, possessed of more ambition than experience. Mary was younger still, perhaps 19, but the match was made, and in 1477, Maximilian journeyed to the Low Countries to marry the richest heiress in Christendom. This marriage did not conquer Burgundy so much as it folded it into the Habsburg patrimony through the simple mechanism of inheritance and consent. Mary brought with her not only the ducal territories but also her claim to the contested regions between France and the Empire, lands that had long been flashpoints of conflict. When Mary died only a decade later, in 1482, at the age of 25, Maximilian found himself guardian of her immense holdings and father to 2 young children. He was now Duke of Burgundy in his own right, or at least so he claimed, though France would contest this for generations. The Low Countries, modern Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of northern France, now belonged to the Habsburg sphere. These were not backward alpine valleys, but centres of cloth manufacture, banking, and commerce. They were wealthy beyond measure. Maximilian had tripled the Habsburg domain in a single generation. But Maximilian was not finished. Having gained Burgundy through one marriage, he understood that the same mechanism could be extended further still. He began to look south, towards Spain, which by the 1480s was consolidating under Ferdinand and Isabella's joint rule. Their union had proved extraordinarily fruitful in terms of children, and their Catholic monarchs were consolidating their power, completing the conquest of Granada from Muslim hands, and preparing to sponsor explorations that would alter forever the European perception of the world. Maximilian arranged marriages for his children with the children of Ferdinand and Isabella. His son Philip was married to Joanna, the daughter of the Spanish monarchs. His daughter Margaret was married to John, the Portuguese heir. Through these marriages, the Habsburg line became bound to the fate of the Iberian Peninsula at the precise moment when Spain was emerging as a major European power. When Isabella and Ferdinand's other children began to die, and several did, leaving only Joanna as a surviving heir, the line of succession shifted in a way that no one could have predicted. Maximilian's grandson, the child of Philip and Joanna, would inherit not only Austria and Burgundy, but potentially Spain itself. This was the slow, patient accumulation that Frederick and Maximilian understood. Each marriage was a calculated investment in future possibility. No armies marched, no treasuries were emptied, no widows wept for sons lost to battle. Instead, notaries drew up contracts, witnesses signed their names, and the boundaries of empire shifted as imperceptibly as the seasons changing. The mouths that would eat from Habsburg tables multiplied. The lands that paid taxes to Habsburg coffers expanded. The titles that Habsburg princes could claim grew longer and more sonorous with each passing year. One can imagine the Habsburg court slowly filling with the weight of this accumulation, not through conquest, but through succession, through inheritance, through the patience of generations, playing a game whose rules they understood better than any other dynasty in Europe. Frederick's peaceful nature, once mocked, had proven to be not weakness, but a different kind of strength. The strength of those who could see further ahead than their contemporaries, who understood that blood was thicker than steel, and that the marriage bed could accomplish what the battlefield never could. It was the autumn of 1477, in a moment that would reshape the map of Europe almost by accident, that a young Habsburg prince found himself standing in the Belgian city of Bruges, watching a funeral procession wind through rain-slicked streets. The woman in the ornate coffin, Mary of Burgundy, widow of the Duke, one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in Christendom, had just died after a riding accident, leaving behind not only the vast Burgundian territories, but also an heir, a young daughter, and a kingdom in peril. The question that hung over the Low Countries in those desperate months was simple but urgent. Who would marry Mary's widow, Philip of Burgundy? And in doing so, who would inherit the most valuable lands in Western Europe? The duchies, the cities, the trade routes, the treasures accumulated over generations, all of it was suddenly, unexpectedly on offer. Every king in Europe, it seemed, had a son or a nephew or a distant cousin waiting in the wings. But it was Maximilian, not yet emperor, not yet even particularly famous, merely the ambitious young heir to the scattered Habsburg lands, who understood something that others had overlooked. While other princes thought of conquest, of armies, of the slow, bloody business of siege warfare, Maximilian thought of genealogy. He understood that the pen, or rather, the marriage contract, could accomplish what swords required decades to achieve. He travelled to the Low Countries with all the romance and calculation of a man playing the highest stakes game imaginable. And in the winter of 1477, against the wishes of many in Burgundy who feared Habsburg ambition, he married Mary of Burgundy. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable spirit and intelligence, already ruling in her own right, and the marriage was as much a partnership of equals as the medieval world allowed. But what mattered, what changed history, was not the emotional tenor of their union, but its consequence. Through this single marriage, the Habsburgs acquired Burgundy, the Low Countries, portions of what would become Belgium and the Netherlands, and access to wealth that would fund their ambitions for centuries to come. By this marriage, without firing a significant arrow, without devastating countryside or emptying treasuries in prolonged warfare, Maximilian had done what took other kingdoms generations of bloodshed to accomplish. And so it was that, perhaps in the generation after Maximilian, or perhaps in the time of his successors, the timeline is a touch hazy here, as these things often are in history, there emerged a phrase. Whether it was coined by court poets, or by Maximilian himself in a moment of satisfaction, or simply by the collective observation of diplomats watching the Habsburg family accumulate territory through betrothals and ceremonies rather than cannons, no one can say with absolute certainty. But the sentiment coalesced into words that became almost a motto, whispered through the chancelleries of Europe. Let others wage war. You, Austria, marry. It sounds almost like a joke, doesn't it? As if someone had finally articulated the secret that the Habsburgs had stumbled upon, that in a world obsessed with martial valor and conquest, they had found a quieter, far more effective path. And yet it was no joke. It was perhaps the most serious strategic insight of the late medieval period. Think of the beauty of it from the Habsburg perspective. While the kings of France bled their treasuries and their armies fighting in Italy or against England, while the Spanish monarchs launched crusades and expeditions, the Habsburgs could sit in Vienna and arrange marriages. With each wedding, a claim could be established. With each birth of an heir, legitimacy could spread across lands they did not yet control. With each betrothal of a daughter to a foreign prince, they secured alliances that would endure through generations. It was patient. It was cumulative. It was in many ways inevitable. Within a few generations of Maximilian's marriage to Mary, the Habsburgs had through calculated unions woven themselves into the succession of Spain itself. They had claims in Hungary. They had influence in countless smaller principalities, and all without the devastation that war brings, without the uncertainty of battle, without the need to maintain vast standing armies in peacetime. Of course, what the phrase did not capture, what perhaps could never be fully captured in 4 simple lines, was the other side of this calculus. If you marry extensively, if you marry strategically, if generation after generation you marry cousins and relatives to preserve bloodlines and consolidate power, then you are also setting in motion something else. You are beginning, almost invisibly, almost inadvertently, to narrow the genetic well from which your heirs will draw. You are accumulating recessive traits. You are ensuring that, eventually, centuries down the line, the very blood that brought you power would begin, slowly and inexorably, to undermine it. But that was a reckoning for a much later age. In the time of Maximilian, in the autumn light of 1477, when a young prince married a widow and united 2 great territories through ceremony rather than siege, the future seemed limitless. The phrase, "Let others wage war, you, Austria, marry," had been born from observation and wisdom. It would not yet occur to anyone that this strategy, pursued with such relentless consistency, would eventually exact a price written in the very faces of the dynasty's descendants. Within those marble halls where light fell through high windows in precise geometric patterns, the business of being Habsburg was itself a kind of performance, a carefully orchestrated dance that governed not just the affairs of empire, but the very hours of each day, the way one moved through a room, the exact angle at which a hand might be extended or withdrawn. The court existed in a state of perpetual formality, and yet within that formality there bloomed a strange kind of intimacy, a knowing shared among thousands of people that they were all participating in a necessary fiction together. Consider the morning ritual of a Habsburg emperor or empress. Before the sun had fully risen above Vienna's rooftops, before even the closest advisers had taken their positions in the antechambers, there was the ceremonial levee, the official waking of the monarch. This was not simply a private moment of rising from sleep. It was theatre, a carefully choreographed sequence of entries and exits, each person in the household knowing precisely when they might enter, what they might say, where they should stand. Chamberlains would arrive first. Then gradually the layers of court would peel open like an onion, each rank adding itself to the presence, until by mid-morning a single person dressing had become a kind of public spectacle watched by dozens of attendants, none of whom were there by accident. Every fold of fabric was witnessed. Every choice of jewel was noted and would be discussed in whispered conversations that echoed through the palace corridors by afternoon. The clothes themselves were remarkable artifacts, designed not for comfort or movement, but for the projection of authority and the subtle communication of rank. For the men of the dynasty, the military uniform became almost a second skin, though these were not the practical garments of a soldier, but rather ornate creations heavy with gold thread, jeweled buttons, and sashes of honor that required their own attendants to manage. The Spanish Habsburgs, in particular, favored a style of almost suffocating formality, where the fashions that dominated court could make a simple walk across a room into an exercise of deliberate slowness. Ruffs so vast they required their own support structures ringed the necks of courtiers. Sleeves ballooned with such fullness that a man had to pass sideways through certain doorways. The silhouette was one of deliberate impediment, as if fashion itself was meant to slow the pace of life within the palace to something almost dreamlike, measured, ritualistic. For the women of the Habsburg court, the transformation was equally complete. Elaborate gowns, with skirts so wide they could barely fit through standard doorways, required planning for their movement through spaces. Hairstyles that took hours to arrange were held in place with oils and pomades and small mechanical devices. Heavy jewelry hung from necks and wrists, not for decoration alone, but as a kind of visible declaration of inherited wealth and power. The makeup applied to Habsburg ladies' faces followed strict conventions, dictated partly by fashion and partly by a need to present a unified aesthetic standard, a visual language that announced before a word was spoken that here was a woman of rank, of lineage, of consequence. Some historians have wondered whether this investment in appearance was less about vanity than about compliance, about the need to demonstrate through the body itself that one understood the rules, accepted the structure, would play one's part in the elaborate machinery of court life. The day itself was divided into specific moments, each with its own protocols and procedures. There was the time for formal audiences, where suitors or ambassadors would be admitted to present petitions or documents, and in those moments, the Habsburg being approached would sit in a particular position, maintain a particular expression, allow a particular distance between their body and the supplicants. There was the time for meals, which were themselves conducted with such formality that the act of eating seemed almost incidental to the larger ceremony of dining. Servants moved in carefully choreographed patterns. Dishes were presented in a specific order. Conversation followed unspoken rules about what topics were appropriate, what tone of voice was acceptable, what kinds of humor would be tolerated. One might wonder, hearing this, whether the people who lived within such constraints ever felt the weight of it, or whether, like a fish in water, they simply accepted it as the natural state of existence. The physical layout of Habsburg palaces was itself designed to reinforce hierarchies and control movement. Long galleries, stretched out like institutional corridors, but galleries that were also spaces to be seen and to see. Smaller rooms branched off from these main spaces, each one with its own purpose and its own traditions about who could enter and when. The private apartments of the ruling family were quite small actually, modest in comparison to the vast state rooms used for ceremonies and receptions. This created an interesting contrast. The more public a space was, the more ornate and impressive it became, while the spaces where the Habsburg rulers actually spent their private hours were often surprisingly intimate and restrained. Some have suggested this reflected something fundamental about the nature of their power, that the enormity of their authority was something that had to be performed in grand spaces, but that in private moments, away from observation, they could simply be themselves, whatever that might mean to someone so constrained by duty and responsibility. The evening brought different protocols. After supper, there might be music or dancing in the staterooms, and here the formal structure of the day loosened slightly, though not by much. A Habsburg ruler might dance, but only with partners deemed appropriate by rank and connection. Conversation might become slightly more animated, but always within the bounds of decorum. By candlelight, in those rooms where hundreds of tapers would burn to illuminate an evening's entertainment, the palace became almost dreamlike, less a seat of government than a kind of glittering theatre where everyone understood they had a role to play, and that the performance itself, somehow, was the point. One cannot fully separate this culture of ceremony from the practical concerns of dynastic rule. A court so formalized was also, in many ways, a court one could control. When every movement was prescribed, when every conversation had its expected shape and flow, there was less room for surprise, less opportunity for genuine disagreement or miscommunication. The etiquette was not merely aesthetic, it was a method of governance, a way of maintaining order and hierarchy through the simple expedient of making everything predictable. And predictability, for a dynasty trying to hold together territories speaking different languages, practicing different religions, and separated by vast distances, was worth almost any price. The weight of ceremony became, in a strange way, a kind of weight that held the empire together, that prevented centrifugal forces from tearing it apart. Yet there is something poignant in contemplating these people, dressed in clothes so elaborate they barely allowed for natural movement, confined within palaces whose very architecture enforced submission to tradition, bound by rules so intricate that entire careers could be devoted to understanding them. What was lost, one might wonder, in all of this formal precision? What human impulses were suppressed? What spontaneity was forbidden? What simple joys were deemed inappropriate for people of such station? These questions hang in the candle-lit air of those vanished rooms like dust motes caught in light, answerable now only through fragmentary records and the fading testimony of those who served these courts. And so the family that had once ruled from a modest castle in the Swiss valleys found itself, by the turn of the 16th century, in possession of something almost unimaginable. Through the patient accumulation of marriages, through the meticulous planning of dynasties, intersecting with the accidents of death and inheritance, the Habsburgs had become the guardians of an empire that spanned the known world. To understand how this happened, we must follow the thread of a single man whose life became the hinge upon which European power would turn. Charles V was born in Ghent in 1500, and he inherited not one throne but many, as though the map of Europe itself had been drawn specifically for him alone. His maternal grandmother was Isabella of Castile, the queen who had financed Columbus and unified Spain. His paternal grandfather was Maximilian I, the very man who had married his way into Burgundy and secured Austria for the Habsburg line. And so Charles, almost without effort, almost by the mere fact of his breathing, came to embody the convergence of every careful marriage contract that had come before him. When his grandfather Maximilian died in 1519, Charles inherited the Habsburg lands in Austria, the Low Countries through his mother's line, and the kingdoms of Spain, which had only recently been unified under Isabella and Ferdinand. And then, in a moment of extraordinary significance, the young man was elected Holy Roman Emperor, a title that had not been granted to the Habsburgs before, a confirmation that they had ascended beyond mere regional power into something approaching universal Christian authority. The title was largely ceremonial by then, it is true, but it carried immense symbolic weight. Charles was now not only a king but an emperor, a protector of the faith, a figure standing at the apex of European Christendom. The phrase emerged during his reign, though perhaps not in the exact form we often hear it now, the idea that while other dynasties waged wars of conquest, the Habsburgs married. But Charles V was different. He was a man who understood that marriage alone could not hold such a disparate collection of kingdoms together. He found himself at war almost constantly against the Ottoman Empire, which pressed at the borders of his Austrian lands from the east, against France, which surrounded his holdings and coveted the wealthy territories of Burgundy and Milan, and against the very currents of religious reformation that were beginning to tear Christendom apart. Yet the empire he commanded was, in material terms, almost incomprehensibly vast. Spain itself had only recently expanded, pushing outward across the Atlantic in the very year Charles was born. By the time he came to power, Spanish conquistadors were reporting back from Mexico, from Central America, from the Caribbean islands. Gold and silver were beginning to flow westward into Spanish treasuries, and so Charles found himself in an extraordinary position. He was emperor of territories in Europe, ruler of kingdoms in the New World, possessor of wealth that seemed, to many observers, nearly inexhaustible. The metaphor that arose during this period was one that captured the imagination of the age. Charles's empire was so vast, they said, that the sun never set upon it. Somewhere in his dominions, at every moment of the day and night, the light of sunrise was breaking over one of his territories, and somewhere else, the sun was sinking below the horizon. It was not merely a poetic flourish, though it was certainly that. It was a genuine geographical fact. From the perspective of a person living in Madrid or Vienna, it felt as though Charles had inherited the world itself. The Spanish kingdoms brought not only vast territories but the beginnings of genuine wealth from the New World, but they also brought complexity, danger, instability. Ruling Spain from Vienna was nearly impossible. Ruling Austria from Madrid was equally fraught with difficulty. The people of Castile did not think of themselves as part of a greater Habsburg whole. They thought of themselves as Spanish, and they did not always welcome a ruler who spoke their language imperfectly and spent much of his time attending to matters that seemed distant and irrelevant to their own concerns. In the Low Countries, in Austria, in Italy, similar tensions were brewing. The question that began to form, almost unspoken, in the minds of courtiers and advisers throughout the 1520s and 1530s was whether any single man could possibly govern such an empire. Charles was capable, well-educated, pious, intelligent, and yet the sheer weight of what he had inherited seemed, increasingly, to bend beneath his shoulders. Do you wonder, listening to this, whether there are moments when immense power becomes not a gift but a curse, when the accumulation of authority transforms from aspiration into burden? What happened was that Charles, in an act that was almost unprecedented for a Habsburg, decided to divide his inheritance. As he aged, as his health declined, he suffered from a combination of ailments, some of them likely inherited, others acquired through the terrible stress of constant warfare. He made a choice that would reshape the family's future. He could not imagine his sons governing an undivided empire any more than he could govern it himself with ease. And so he began to plan a partition. His brother Ferdinand had already been established as his representative in the Eastern Habsburg lands, in Austria and Hungary. Charles decided that Ferdinand would continue in this role, inheriting the Austrian territories, the claims to Hungary and Bohemia, and the title of Holy Roman Emperor, that great symbolic position that seemed to matter to so many, even if its practical power had ebbed away over the centuries. Ferdinand was a man of patience, of relative quiet, someone who understood that ruling the heartland of Europe required a different kind of authority than ruling the far-flung Spanish kingdoms. Can you imagine the sense of relief that must have come to Ferdinand when he realized that he would not have to attempt to govern Spain from Vienna? And so Charles's son Philip received the jewel of the inheritance: Spain, the Low Countries, southern Italy, and the vast New World territories that Spain had conquered and was still in the process of absorbing and exploiting. Philip would become Philip II, and his reign would define what it meant to be a Spanish Habsburg, ruling a kingdom that would seem for a time to possess limitless resources and limitless ambition. The Spanish sun never set, as they would proudly say, not because of any geographical accident, but because Philip and his successors had built a naval power and a colonial empire that had no rival on earth. The empire of Charles V thus did not disappear after his death. Rather, it transformed, split into two great branches, like a river dividing around an island, each branch carrying away different currents, different destinies, different futures. The Austrian Habsburgs would learn to think of themselves as the keepers of Central Europe, as the defenders of Christendom against the Ottoman threat, as the guardians of a more ancient, more rooted kind of authority. The Spanish Habsburgs would become, for a time, the wealthiest rulers in Christendom, commanding fleets and armies, engaged in a long, slow contest with the emerging powers of France and England for dominance on the world stage. And yet they would be one family still, united by blood, by tradition, and by the curious Habsburg conviction that wherever they ruled, the world could not help but turn in their favor. By the early 16th century, as the Habsburg territories sprawled across an almost incomprehensible expanse of European geography, a question began to form in the minds of those who governed them. How could one family possibly hold such vast dominions in their hands? The answer, it seemed, was that they couldn't. Not entirely, not for long. The turning point arrived quietly, without fanfare or declaration, in the year 1505. Charles V, who had ruled the greatest empire the world had seen since Rome itself, found himself aging, weary, and aware of a truth that had been gnawing at him for years. His empire was too large, his responsibilities were too many, his breath was growing short, and the weight of administration from Madrid to Vienna to Brussels had become, perhaps, too much even for a Habsburg to bear. So he did something remarkable. He divided his inheritance. He split the dynasty itself into two separate branches, as though taking a great family tree and pruning it into two distinct growths, each to flourish or fade according to its own fortunes and the hands that held its branches. His son Philip inherited the Spanish territories, Spain itself, of course, with all its wealth flowing in from the Americas, the silver and gold that made Spanish power seem almost infinite, but also the Netherlands, the most commercially vibrant region in all of Europe, also parts of Italy, also the vast Spanish-American Empire, those territories across the Atlantic that were still being explored, mapped, understood only dimly through the reports of conquistadors and merchants. To rule Spain was to rule a power that seemed, in those early decades of the division, the very pinnacle of European authority. Charles's brother Ferdinand, by contrast, received the Austrian territories, less glamorous perhaps in the telling, less obviously wealthy, but the heart of the Habsburg domain nonetheless. Austria itself, and the pathway into Central Europe, into Hungary, into the domains that would slowly, inexorably, become the core of Habsburg identity. And so the great tree split into two limbs, the Spanish Habsburgs in the west and south, radiant with Atlantic wealth, the Austrian Habsburgs in the center and east, rooted deeper into the older soil of medieval Europe. For the first century or so after this division, the Spanish branch seemed, to all appearances, the more fortunate. Spanish gold seemed inexhaustible. Spanish armies, though not always victorious, were formidable. Spanish culture exported itself around the world. A Habsburg king in Madrid could afford to commission artists of genius, to fund expeditions, to maintain courts of legendary splendor. The Spanish Habsburgs built El Escorial, that austere and magnificent palace monastery that stands even today as a monument to their power and their piety intertwined. They patronized Velázquez, perhaps the greatest painter of the age, whose works capture the Habsburg visage with such precision, such unflinching honesty, that even now we feel we know these distant monarchs by looking at his canvases. And yet, almost imperceptibly at first, the fortunes began to diverge. The Spanish branch found itself increasingly entangled in wars that drained the treasury far faster than the American silver could replenish it. The wars in the Netherlands against Protestant rebels consumed men and money. The wars against the French seemed never to end. The armada sent against England in 1588 returned broken and diminished. Each conflict was a small leak in the vessel, and over time, these leaks accumulated into something that could not be stopped. Meanwhile, the Austrian branch, which might have seemed the poorer cousin at the moment of division, began to demonstrate a different kind of strength. While Spain was fighting distant enemies in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, Austria was consolidating power in its home territories. The Austrian Habsburgs gradually brought Hungary under their authority. They developed a more stable administrative apparatus, not necessarily because they were wiser, but because their territories were more compact, more manageable, more capable of being governed from a single center. Vienna, that ancient Roman city on the Danube, became the seat of power, and from Vienna, the Austrian Habsburgs could project authority outward into the tangled and contested lands of Central Europe in ways that Madrid simply could not replicate across the Atlantic. The great wars of religion that tore at Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries affected both branches, but in different ways. Spain, as the great Catholic power, saw itself as the defender of the faith against the Protestant North. Austria, meanwhile, found itself navigating a more complex religious landscape, with Protestants and Catholics intermixed in its territories, requiring strategies of both force and accommodation that kept the dynasty rooted in the region even as its neighbors fragmented. By the 17th century, the gap between the two branches had become unmistakable. Spain was declining, not suddenly, not catastrophically at first, but with a slow, steady loss of relative power. Its silver supplies from America did not flow as abundantly as before. Its rivals, particularly France under Louis XIV, were matching its military strength and often exceeding it. The greatest Spanish artists of the age, like Velázquez himself, seemed to be painting a dynasty that was becoming aware of its own diminishment, even as they rendered it in colors of extraordinary beauty. Austria, by contrast, began to rise. When the 30 Years' War ravaged Central Europe in the mid-17th century, Austria endured it, absorbed it, and emerged from it not destroyed but transformed. The Austrian Habsburgs became the bulwark against Ottoman expansion from the east, a role that gave them a particular identity, a particular purpose. They became, in a sense, the defenders of Christian Europe against the Turkish threat, and from this role came a kind of authority that gold and distant empires could not quite match. Can we say that the division itself caused these different fates, or was it merely that one branch, by chance of geography and circumstance, found itself in a position to flourish, while the other encountered headwinds that no amount of administrative skill could fully overcome? The answer is probably both. The branches inherited different territories, yes, but they also inherited different challenges. They made different choices, pursued different strategies. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynasty that had once seemed unified under Charles V became two distinct powers, with two distinct futures. By the 18th century, when we look back at the Habsburg map of Europe, we see Austria as the dominant power, the core of what was becoming increasingly a Central European empire. Spain, still wealthy, still powerful in the Mediterranean and in the Americas, had become secondary in European affairs. A reversal had occurred, so gradual that observers living through it might not have noticed it clearly, but unmistakable to historians looking back across the centuries. And yet the two branches remained family. They remained aware of their common heritage, their common blood, even as their fortunes diverged. Marriages continued between them, alliances were struck and restruck, and the consciousness of being part of a greater whole persisted even as the reality of political power shifted irrevocably toward Vienna and away from Madrid. It is one of the peculiar characteristics of dynastic power that family unity and political rivalry can coexist, sometimes uneasily, sometimes quite naturally. The Habsburgs, even when divided into separate branches, were never quite separate. They were branches of one tree, even if the tree itself was growing in unexpected directions. And yet, beneath the splendor of those gilded halls and the mathematical precision of those dynastic marriages, something else was quietly happening, something that no amount of courtly pageantry or imperial decree could arrest. It moved through the bloodlines like a slow current, generation after generation, accumulating in silence where no one wished to acknowledge it. The cost of purity, the price paid not in gold or territory, but in the very substance of flesh and bone and breath. When a family marries only within itself, when cousins wed cousins, when uncles took their nieces as brides, when the pool of acceptable partners grew smaller and smaller until it seemed there was nowhere left to turn but inward, something inevitable begins to unfold in the biology itself. This is what scholars and physicians call consanguinity. The practice, however necessary it seemed to those who guarded the throne, of reproducing among blood relations. It is not a concept unique to the Habsburgs. Many royal houses across Europe, across the centuries, have danced this particular dance, but few did it quite so systematically, quite so deliberately, for quite so long as this austere Austrian family. The mathematics of it are almost dreamlike in their simplicity. Each generation, the web of relationship tightens. A child born to cousins carries within them the recombined genetics of ancestors already shared. Those genetic traits, whether strength or weakness, beauty or infirmity, begin to concentrate. Recessive genes, the ones that might pass silently through a broader population, begin to find each other. They begin to express themselves. A trait that appeared once, perhaps benignly, in a great-grandfather, might surface again in a grandchild, and then again in that child's offspring, each time a little more pronounced, a little more visible in the mirror. It is as if the Habsburgs were conducting an unintended experiment in human heredity, playing out across centuries in the grandest ballrooms of Europe. The irony, of course, is that they pursued these marriages precisely because they believed they were doing the opposite, preserving bloodline purity, keeping the imperial essence untainted by the dilution of lesser nobility. They were protecting the dynasty, or so they thought. They were, in a manner both subtle and inexorable, reshaping their own biology with every marriage contract that was signed. Consider what happened over the course of 6 centuries. In the earliest generations, when the Habsburgs were still regional powers in Switzerland and the Alpine territories, the pool of potential marriage partners was necessarily broader. The family married outward into the minor nobility of neighboring lands, strengthened themselves through alliances with Burgundy and Spain and Bohemia. The genetic diversity, though limited by the standards of a broader population, was at least present. There was room to move, there was space. But as power concentrated, as the Habsburg claim stretched across more of Europe, as they became not merely one family among many, but something approaching a continental force, the calculus changed. A suitable marriage partner for an Austrian archduke could not simply be any noblewoman of appropriate station. She had to be of imperial caliber. She had to bring lands or protection or legitimacy. She had to be, in a very real sense, family. Or at least, she had to be nearly so. And so, generation by generation, the circles overlapped more completely. the lines of relationship became redundant. The genetic material, once distributed across dozens of family trees, began to circle back upon itself like water caught in an eddy. What did this mean in practical terms? What did it feel like to live inside this slowly tightening knot? The answer lies partly in the portraits. The paintings commissioned by Habsburg rulers across the centuries offer, if you look closely and know what to look for, a kind of visual record of this accumulation. In the faces of the earliest Habsburgs, Rudolf I, Frederick III, there is a certain solidity, a natural proportion. The features are recognizable as human in the way we expect. The jawline is strong. The eyes sit properly in their sockets. But as you move forward through the galleries, as you watch the procession of emperors and empresses march across canvas and panel, something shifts, almost imperceptibly at first, then with growing clarity. Certain features begin to appear with increasing frequency, a particular configuration of the lower face, a certain set to the jaw, a thickness of the lip. These are not, in themselves, markers of illness or deformity in any dramatic sense. They are simply traits, hereditary traits, accumulating across the generations like sediment in still water. It would take centuries for anyone to truly understand what was happening. Medicine in the medieval and Renaissance periods was, after all, still grounded largely in the theory of humors and the movements of planets. The idea that hereditary weakness could accumulate through careful breeding, that the very strategies meant to preserve excellence could instead compress and concentrate vulnerability. This was not yet part of the intellectual vocabulary available to the Habsburg court physicians. They observed what they saw. They treated what ailments came before them, but they could not name the underlying pattern, not yet. And perhaps it is in this gap, between what was happening and what was understood to be happening, that the real poignancy of the Habsburg story resides. The family pursued its marriages with the best intentions, guided by the logic of their age, the necessities of power, the desire to preserve what they had built. They could not have known that they were, in effect, running their own slow-motion experiment in genetic concentration. They could not have anticipated that the very instruments they wielded to defend their position, these calculated, considered, carefully arranged unions, would gradually reshape the bodies and minds of their descendants. The realization would come only later, when the evidence became impossible to ignore, when it was already woven too deeply into the fabric of the family to easily unravel. And yet, beneath all the grandeur of empire and the mathematical precision of dynastic strategy, there existed another story, one written not in marriage contracts or peace treaties, but in the very flesh and bone of the Habsburg line itself. If you were to wander through the great galleries of Vienna or Madrid, moving slowly from portrait to portrait across the centuries, you would begin to notice something peculiar, something that no courtier would ever speak of aloud, yet which every painter's brush seemed compelled to record with unflinching accuracy. There, in the carefully composed faces of kings and queens, in the royal children posed in their velvet and jewels, a pattern emerges, a subtle distortion of the lower jaw, a prominence that grows more pronounced as you move forward through time, as though the very act of keeping power within the bloodline was reshaping the bloodline itself. This characteristic became known, centuries later, as the Habsburg jaw. It is perhaps the most visible inheritance the family ever received, and certainly the most unfortunate. Look at Charles V in his portraits from middle age, or Ferdinand I, or any number of lesser princes and princesses whose names history has largely forgotten. There is a pronounced protrusion of the lower face, a jutting of the chin that makes normal speech difficult, that interferes with proper mastication, that marks the bearer as visibly different from the rest of Europe's nobility. The condition appears in the painted record so consistently, appearing and reappearing across generations like an unwelcome guest who refuses to leave, that it became almost synonymous with the dynasty itself. For a very long time, the Habsburg jaw occupied a strange space between folklore and medical reality. Popular imagination transformed it into something almost mythical, a curse upon the house, a divine punishment for ambition, a mark of degeneracy that proved the dynasty's inevitable decline. Pamphleteers and satirists seized upon it gleefully, exaggerating its severity until they had created a caricature almost unrecognizable from the actual affliction. Whispers circulated through European courts that the Habsburgs were becoming something less than fully human, that their intermarriage had created a family of monsters. The jaw became, in the minds of many, the visible embodiment of everything wrong with absolute monarchy, with the concentration of power, with the elevation of bloodline above all other consideration. But what was actually happening was far more prosaic, far more rooted in simple genetics, and in many ways far more tragic. The Habsburg jaw, as modern physicians came to understand it, was not a single condition, but rather the visual expression of mandibular prognathism, a structural abnormality of the lower jawbone in which the mandible projects forward beyond the normal range of variation. It is not, in itself, particularly rare. Many people throughout human history have exhibited this trait to varying degrees. What made it notable in the Habsburg case was not the presence of the condition, but rather its concentration. Where you might expect to find this trait scattered sparsely across a population, appearing by accident and chance in perhaps one person in several thousand, among the Habsburgs it appeared with disturbing frequency, with mounting severity, generation after generation. The explanation lay in a mechanism that geneticists came to call the coefficient of inbreeding. When a family restricts its marriages exclusively within its own bloodline, when cousin marries cousin, when uncle marries niece, when the pool of acceptable partners shrinks and shrinks until it becomes a mere puddle, recessive traits begin to surface with increasing regularity. A gene that might have been present, harmless and hidden, in a distant ancestor, could suddenly, through the concentrated repetition of shared bloodlines, express itself in offspring. And once expressed, if both parents carried the trait, it would intensify in their children and their children's children, accumulating like interest on a debt that would be paid not in money but in medical affliction. The Habsburg jaw was, in essence, a visible record of how long the family had been marrying among themselves. You could, if you knew how to read the faces in the portraits, trace the history of their intermarriage, written across the lower faces of successive generations. The jaw that was barely noticeable in a child might become pronounced by middle age, might become so severe in the next generation as to affect speech and eating. What had been a minor deviation in a 16th century marriage partner became a family characteristic, then a family curse, then an inescapable fact of the family's biological reality. And this was not the only inheritance born of such constant intermarriage. The Habsburg physicians, who kept meticulous records in their private archives, noted with increasing concern a rising prevalence of other conditions, a brittleness of bone, a fragility of constitution, a susceptibility to illness that seemed to increase with each royal generation. There were whispered concerns about fertility, about miscarriage, about children born to mothers and fathers who were themselves the products of cousin marriage, carrying doubled and redoubled doses of genes that, while not inherently harmful in isolation, became problematic when concentrated. Yet the family's physicians were bound by loyalty and by the structure of power itself to frame these observations carefully, to speak in coded language, to avoid any suggestion that the dynasty itself might be weakening from within. How could a doctor tell the Holy Roman Emperor that his own genetic inheritance was fragmenting? How could such truths be spoken in a court where the entire legitimacy of rule rested on the assumption of superior bloodlines? So the condition persisted, visible and undeniable in oil and canvas, yet somehow unspoken in the great halls where power was actually exercised. Courtiers learned not to comment. Artists learned to position their royal subjects in three-quarter profile when the jaw was particularly pronounced, or to soften the lines with careful brushwork. And the family continued its intermarrying, driven by the logic that had seemed so sound in the medieval period, that power must stay within the bloodline, that every heir must marry within the acceptable circle of European royalty, and that the acceptable circle had long ago become a cage. The Habsburg jaw became, over time, something almost like a family joke, a dark humour employed in private chambers, a reminder of the price paid for centuries of dynastic calculation. It haunted the family not as a moral judgment, because the Habsburgs were not particularly inclined toward moral self-examination, but as a practical problem. How do you convince foreign powers to accept a marriage alliance with a dynasty, when the visible signs of that dynasty's biological strain are written across the face of every prince and princess you might offer them? It is one of history's quieter ironies that the very strategy that had elevated the Habsburgs to continental power, the disciplined, calculated use of marriage as a tool of empire, had also begun to hollow out the physical foundation of that empire from within. Each union designed to consolidate power carried within it the seeds of biological consequence. Each marriage that kept the bloodline pure, according to dynastic logic, made the bloodline itself less viable, less robust, more prone to the emergence of traits that medicine could not cure and that power could not overcome. By the late 17th century, the weight of dynasty had begun to settle visibly upon the Spanish Habsburg line, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the person of Charles II, the last of his name to wear the Spanish crown. Born in 1661 to the union of uncle and niece, a marriage that would have scandalized lesser courts, but seemed almost routine within the careful geometry of Habsburg genealogy, Charles entered a world already shadowed by the exhaustion of empires and the slow biological toll of centuries spent marrying within the family's own bloodline. The boy who would become king was not robust. Even contemporary chroniclers, bound by the courtly duty to flatter their sovereign, could not entirely disguise what their eyes recorded. Portraits from his childhood show a peculiar heaviness to his lower face, a protrusion of the jaw that seemed to grow more pronounced with each passing year, as though the very structure of his skull were being rewritten by forces beyond anyone's understanding or control. Physicians whispered theories in the shadowed corridors of the Escorial Palace. Some blamed the Castilian heat, others invoked the will of God. But what none of them could quite articulate, bound as they were by the conventions of royal service and the stigma of suggesting anything amiss in the blood of kings, was that Charles was the culmination of generations upon generations of calculated marriages designed to keep power within the family, and the price of such purity was beginning to exact itself with terrible clarity. The condition that would later come to be called the Habsburg jaw, that distinctive mandibular prognathism visible in portrait after portrait, was not merely an aesthetic curiosity, though it would be remembered as such by later historians quick to sensationalize the dynasty's decline. It was, rather, a visible marker of something far more complex and troubling: the slow accumulation of recessive traits, the clustering of genetic variations that occur when a family chooses the bonds of dynasty over the vitality of outmarriage. Charles was the product of such a union, yes, but he was also a victim of it, though he would never have understood himself in those terms. The vocabulary of heredity, of dominant and recessive alleles, of the mechanisms by which traits pass from parent to child, would not exist for another 2 centuries. What existed instead was observation and prayer and the gradual recognition that something was deeply wrong. He was, by all accounts, a gentle soul. Those who knew him spoke of his kindness, his piety, his genuine love for his wife, first Marie-Louise of Orléans, and later the young Maria Anna of Neuburg, whom he married after Marie-Louise's death, and to whom he remained devoted despite his own failing constitution. This gentleness, this capacity for affection and loyalty, seems almost poignant now, when read against the backdrop of his physical struggles and his ultimate inability to produce an heir, that singular purpose toward which every moment of his existence had been directed since birth. He suffered from chronic illness throughout his life, from digestive troubles and infections and respiratory ailments that were never fully explained and could never be fully cured. He spent long periods confined to his chambers, and in his later years, it became increasingly clear that the great Spanish Habsburg line, which had ruled half the known world, which had possessed wealth beyond measure and territories across continents, would end with him. The tragedy was not one of dramatics, but of quiet diminishment. As Charles aged, the question of succession became an obsession not merely within Spain, but throughout the courts of Europe, because a childless death in Madrid meant a vacuum at the heart of one of the continent's great powers, and every ambitious monarch from Paris to Vienna was already calculating the advantages and disadvantages of various claims, various alliances, various wars that might be fought over the inheritance. Charles himself seemed acutely aware of this terrible arithmetic. His marriage to Maria Anna was undertaken with deliberate hope, yet year after year passed without issue, and with each passing season, the emperor's face grew heavier, his movements slower, his breathing more labored. Medical historians have since examined the historical record and concluded that Charles II likely suffered from what might be termed constitutional infertility, a cascading effect of genetic narrowing that left him physically incapable of fathering a child, no matter his own desire or the eagerness of his queens. There is something almost unbearable in contemplating the isolation of such a figure, a king surrounded by thousands, yet utterly alone in his suffering, unable to confide in anyone the full weight of his failure to do the one thing his entire existence had been designed to accomplish. He could not tell his courtiers that he was afraid. He could not admit to his wives that he suspected the fault lay within himself. He could not say aloud what the whole of Europe was beginning to whisper, that the Spanish Habsburgs were dying out, that the grand project of dynastic rule was exhausting itself, that all the marriages and calculations and careful genealogies, stretching back through centuries, had culminated in this single, diminishing man, unable to perpetuate his name. In his final years, Charles withdrew further into the Escorial, that vast and melancholy palace built by his ancestor Philip II as a monument to Spanish Catholic power. He spent his time in prayer, in the company of priests and physicians who could do nothing for him, in watching the light change across the courtyards and the gardens where no children played. His jaw grew more pronounced, more distinctive. His movements became those of an old man long before his time, and yet those who encountered him in these final years spoke of a kind of dignity in his resignation, a spiritual composure that seemed to grow as his body failed him. When he looked into mirrors, and he must have seen what the world saw when it looked at him, he beheld not merely the visible marker of his family's biological decline, but a kind of silent testimony to the price of power, to the way that dynasties pursue their own perpetuation at costs that can be measured in human suffering. The Spanish line would die with him in 1700, at the age of 38, his body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of centuries of inbreeding. He would be remembered not for his kindness or his piety, but for the question his death raised: who would inherit the Spanish throne, and what series of wars and alliances would follow from that single succession? Yet in the quieter histories, in the more compassionate accounts, Charles II emerges as something more than a symbol of decline. He appears as a man who was born into an impossible situation, who lived a life constrained by forces he could neither understand nor escape, and who faced his diminishment with a grace that perhaps no one could have expected, and that very few noticed or recorded. There is something profoundly deliberate about the way a dynasty preserves itself, not merely through the passage of crowns and treaties, but through the careful curation of how it appears to history. The Habsburgs understood this as acutely as any family ever has, and they wielded a weapon far more subtle than armies or edicts: the brush, the canvas, and the written word. When you cannot control your bloodline's fragility, perhaps you can at least control how the world remembers it. Step into the galleries of Vienna, Madrid, or Prague, and you will find yourself surrounded by the deliberate work of generations of court painters, whose names we have largely forgotten, even as their subjects stare out across centuries with an almost unbearable intensity. These were not merely artists hired to flatter, they were architects of dynastic mythology, each one tasked with an impossible commission: to render the Habsburg face, with all its peculiarities, into an image of divine right and unshakable authority. Consider the strange mathematics of portraiture during the Habsburg reign. A painter arrives at court in the early 16th century with instructions to paint the Archduke Philip or the young Maximilian. What he sees before him, in the flesh, may be a pronounced jaw, a receding chin, eyes that do not quite focus in the same direction. The Habsburg face, you see, had begun its slow migration toward the caricature that would eventually define it. Yet here stood the artist, brush in hand, expected to produce an image that would hang in palaces and be copied across kingdoms, an image that would come to represent the very face of European power. The question hangs in the air like paint fumes. Does he paint what he sees, or what he knows must be seen? The answer, across centuries, was neither and both. The great court painters of the Habsburg dynasty developed a language of visual compromise, a kind of artistic diplomacy that acknowledged the reality of the face while elevating it beyond mere portraiture into allegory. Diego Velázquez, that master of light and shadow who served in the Spanish court, became perhaps the most genius practitioner of this craft. When he painted the Infanta Margarita or the aging Philip IV, he did not erase the Habsburg chin. Rather, he rendered it with such pictorial sophistication, surrounded by such sumptuous fabric and strategic shadow, that the viewer's eye began to accept it as part of a larger visual symphony. The jaw became not a deformity, but a distinguishing mark, a feature that set the royal family apart, the way a scar might mark a warrior or a noble brow a philosopher. There is something almost tender in recognizing this now, across the centuries. These painters were not merely flatterers or propagandists. Many of them were among the finest artists their age produced, and they faced a commission of genuine artistic difficulty. How do you render faithfulness to a subject while maintaining the dignity that portraiture demands, especially when the subject is a king or an emperor? How do you balance the microscopic truth of what you observe with the larger truth of what power must appear to be? Velázquez solved it through genius. Others solved it through convention, through the application of idealization so consistent and so accepted that an entire court, an entire kingdom, began to see the idealized version as more true than the lived reality. The portraits themselves became a kind of visual archive, and here we find perhaps the most enduring role these painters fulfilled. Each portrait was a statement of legitimacy. When Philip II commissioned his portrait to be distributed across the Spanish Empire, that image traveled on ships and through mountain passes, reaching the most distant colonies of the Spanish crown. It entered churches and government buildings. It was reproduced in engravings and distributed further still. In an age before photography, before mass media, the painted face of the monarch became the closest thing to a universal proclamation of power. The painter, in this sense, was distributing the king himself, fragmenting him into copies, ensuring that his presence could be felt across an empire too vast for him ever to physically visit in its entirety. But portraiture, for all its eloquence, is a static art. The Habsburgs understood that they needed another form of preservation, one that could unfold across time and narrative. This is where the court chroniclers enter the story, those patient scribes and historians who sat in the quietest corners of palaces, recording the deeds of emperors and empresses for posterity. Their work was even more invisible than the painters, yet in many ways more consequential. While a portrait might capture a moment and preserve it in amber, a chronicle could construct a narrative, could explain causation, could justify decisions that might otherwise seem capricious or cruel. Consider the impulse behind commissioning a chronicle. An emperor makes a decision that costs lives, triggers resistance, or simply fails to produce the hoped-for result. 20 years later, when the memory of failure has begun to calcify, a court historian is commissioned to write an account of that reign. He consults documents, interviews aging courtiers, examines the records, and as he writes, he discovers, or perhaps invents, the line between the two is surprisingly fine, a narrative logic that makes even the failures intelligible, even virtuous. The emperor did not err, he was misinformed. The generals failed him, not the reverse. The people did not understand the breadth of his vision. Through the slow accumulation of such narratives, what might have been perceived as incompetence or cruelty becomes transformed into historical inevitability, or at worst, tragic necessity. The Habsburg court employed some of the finest minds of each era for this work. They commissioned historians of genuine intellectual power, men who were not mere propagandists but scholars in their own right. This is the subtle genius of it. By employing the best historians available, the dynasty ensured that its image would be preserved not as crude propaganda, which posterity tends to dismiss with a knowing smile, but as something that carried the weight of scholarly authority. When a respected historian writes that the emperor's decision was justified, it carries more weight than if a paid flatterer made the same claim. And yet, and this is where the exhaustion creeps into our contemplation, we must acknowledge the strange truth that these records, these carefully constructed narratives and exquisitely rendered portraits, have become the primary source material by which we now understand the Habsburg dynasty at all. The portraits are the evidence. The chronicles are the testimony, the reality of daily life in the Habsburg court, the actual experience of being a member of the dynasty. All of this has been filtered through these artistic and historical mediations. We are not looking at the Habsburgs as they were, we are looking at the Habsburgs as they chose to be remembered. The irony sits heavy. A family so concerned with controlling its image achieved a kind of immortality, but an immortality of their own making, an immortality composed of shadows and suggestion and the careful arrangement of pigment on canvas. What emerges across centuries is a kind of double consciousness, a genealogy of both the painted face and the lived face. The Habsburg jaw grows more pronounced with each generation, more visible in the raw sketches and medical records, yet somehow less visible in the grand official portraits, which become more elaborate, more ornamented, more assertively magnificent as the dynasty itself begins its long decline. Perhaps this is the final lesson that the court painters and chroniclers have to teach us, that the power to construct one's own image is both a form of mastery and a form of denial, a way of insisting on a truth even as the biological and political reality tells a different story altogether. The more fragile the dynasty became, the more elaborate and insistent its self-presentation grew, until by the final century, the Habsburg court was maintaining an aesthetic and ceremonial structure of almost Byzantine complexity, a vast and glittering architecture of appearance designed to contain and suppress the truth of decline. While the Spanish Habsburgs watched their empire crumble beneath the weight of inbreeding and isolation, their Austrian cousins found themselves in a very different predicament. The split of the dynasty into two branches, formalized after Charles V's abdication in 1556, had left the Austrian line in possession of something the Spanish increasingly lacked: territorial depth, stability, and room to maneuver. And it was this geographical and political resilience that would allow the Austrian Habsburgs not merely to survive, but to transform themselves into something altogether different from their Spanish forebears. The 17th century brought one of Europe's most devastating conflicts to the doorstep of the Habsburg lands. The 30 Years' War, which began in 1618 with a defenestration in Prague, a window, and a religious crisis, threatened to tear apart the fabric of Central Europe entirely. The Austrian Habsburgs, though religiously Catholic and obliged by their position to defend Catholicism against Protestant uprisings, found themselves fighting not just for doctrine, but for the very continuity of their house. And yet, as the decades wore on and armies swept back and forth across Bohemia and Moravia, something curious happened. The Austrians endured. While kingdoms crumbled around them, while France rose and Spain declined, the Habsburgs of Vienna held firm. Why? Perhaps it was geography itself. Landlocked Central Europe could not be so easily conquered by the maritime powers that were beginning to dominate the wider world. Perhaps it was the sheer stubbornness of a dynasty that had learned, over 3 centuries, that marriage and patience could accomplish what force alone could not. Or perhaps it was something simpler still. The Austrian branch, having fewer overseas colonies to defend, fewer far-flung obligations, could concentrate its energies on the solid, unglamorous business of holding territory closer to home. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended that terrible war, reshaped Europe in ways the Habsburgs initially viewed with something approaching despair. They lost territory. They lost prestige. The concept of a unified Christian empire, which had animated their political imagination since the days of Charles V, began to fade. And yet, what remained was theirs, and it was not insignificant. They controlled Austria proper, Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, a vast swathe of Central Europe stretching from the Danube to the Carpathians. Unlike Spain, which had become an increasingly hollow power, Vienna remained the seat of real, tangible authority over millions of subjects. The Habsburgs were no longer the rulers of half the world, but they were undisputed masters of their corner of it. This transition, from universal empire to regional great power, required a fundamental reimagining of what it meant to be Habsburg. The ornate, Spanish-influenced court culture of the 16th century gave way to something more practical, more militaristic, more deeply embedded in the rhythms of Central European politics. Vienna itself became something other than it had been, not the capital of a global domain, but the center of gravity for a new kind of dynastic project. The Baroque splendor that characterized the Austrian court in the 17th and 18th centuries was no longer the expression of a world-conquering ambition, but rather of a different, subtler ambition, to be indispensable, to be permanent, to be the stable center around which the volatile politics of Central Europe would necessarily revolve. The decades following Westphalia were spent in careful consolidation. The Austrian Habsburgs strengthened their hold over Bohemia, which had been a source of instability and Protestant resistance. They pushed southward and eastward, gradually extending their control over Hungary, which had long been semi-independent and restless under Habsburg rule. They faced threats from the Ottoman Empire, which remained a formidable power in the Balkans and along the Danube, and they responded with a mixture of military campaigns and diplomatic maneuvering that became characteristic of the dynasty's later style. Never again would they attempt to rule the world. Instead, they would master the art of ruling what lay before them, of keeping precarious stability in a region where stability was perpetually in danger of shattering. One might wonder, during these middle years of the 17th and early 18th centuries, what kept the dynasty functioning at all, given the biological challenges that had so ravaged the Spanish line? The answer, in part, was geography and access. While the Spanish Habsburgs, isolated in their peninsula and bound to one another through increasingly tight marriage alliances, had found fewer and fewer suitable marriage partners outside their own bloodline, the Austrian Habsburgs maintained broader networks of connection. They married Italian princesses, married into German noble houses, married Polish and Hungarian nobility. The degree of intermarriage certainly remained high by modern standards, far too high, but it never quite reached the catastrophic levels seen in Spain. And so while the Austrian line did develop its own constellation of genetic vulnerabilities, they did not metastasize into the kind of visible, undeniable crisis that rendered the Spanish dynasty incapable of even basic governance. The Habsburgs of Austria also made a conscious choice, as the 17th century wore on, to invest in institutional stability rather than personal magnificence. They began, gradually, to develop a bureaucracy that could function even when the reigning monarch was mediocre or weak. They created systems of administration that did not depend on the particular genius of any one ruler. This represented a quiet revolution in dynastic thinking, an admission, almost unspoken, that the old model of personal rule through the force of charisma or blood right was becoming insufficient. If the Habsburgs were to remain a great power in the modern world, they would have to become something their ancestors might not have quite recognized. Not a family ruling through divine right alone, but an institution, embedded in structures of law and custom and administrative procedure. The military dimension of this redefinition cannot be overlooked. The wars of the Spanish succession and the wars of the Austrian succession, which consumed much of the early 18th century, were contested between European powers in ways that would have been unimaginable 100 years earlier. The Habsburgs found themselves competing for dominance not through marriage alone, though marriage remained important, but through the organization of armies, the maintenance of supply lines, the construction of fortifications, the cultivation of alliances. They were becoming, in other words, a modern state, and the process was neither rapid nor painless, but it happened nonetheless. The dynasty that had once thought of itself as the Christian Empire, as the inheritors of Rome, began to think of itself instead as a great power, which is to say, as primus inter pares, first among equals in a system of competing sovereignties. And yet, even as all of this was unfolding, even as the Austrian Habsburgs were reinventing themselves as regional consolidators rather than world conquerors, something of the old mythology persisted. The idea that the Habsburgs were somehow fated to rule, that they possessed an almost mystical connection to Central Europe, remained embedded in the imagination of their subjects and their rivals alike. This was not mere sentiment, though sentiment played its part. It was rooted in the simple, durable fact that the Habsburgs had been ruling the same territories, more or less, for more than 300 years. They had become, in some sense, inseparable from the landscape itself. To imagine Central Europe without the Habsburgs had become almost impossible. In the middle of the 18th century, when the Habsburg name had begun to carry a kind of weariness across Europe, a woman ascended the throne of Austria in circumstances that seemed nearly impossible. Maria Theresa, born into a dynasty of sons and daughters, found herself the sole surviving heir to her father Charles VI, when the machinery of imperial succession ground to a halt. It was 1740, she was 23 years old, and the great powers of Europe, sensing blood in the water, sensing hesitation, began to circle. Frederick of Prussia would invade Silesia within months. Bavaria and Saxony would stake their own claims. The empire her ancestors had spent centuries binding together through marriage and law seemed poised to fragment like autumn glass. And yet something remarkable happened in those early years of her reign. Where others saw a young woman burdened by an impossible inheritance, Maria Theresa saw the architecture of an aging structure and began, with deliberate purpose, to rebuild it from within. She was not a conqueror in the manner of her distant ancestor Maximilian. She was something perhaps more necessary at that moment in history. She was a reformer, moving with the weight of inevitability toward the modernization that the empire desperately required. The War of Austrian Succession would consume much of her early rule, a grueling conflict that depleted treasuries and exhausted her armies. But even as she fought, and fought with a determination that would have surprised those who underestimated her, she was simultaneously imagining a different kind of state. She understood, in a way that many of her royal contemporaries did not, that empires could no longer survive on the strength of marriages alone. The world was changing. The machinery of power had to change with it. What was it, one might ask, that made her so different from the princes and rulers who had come before? Perhaps it was that she had no sons at first, no obvious male heir to whom tradition demanded she defer. Perhaps it was that she had married for diplomatic stability rather than for passion, and had learned something about the weight of duty that transcended the romantic languages of court. Or perhaps, and this carries its own quiet truth, she had simply been raised with a kind of intellectual rigor that her ancestors had neglected. She read histories, she listened to advisors, she was curious about the mechanics of how empires actually functioned. The reforms that would come to define her reign began almost as soon as the immediate military threats had stabilized. She restructured the central administration, creating new bodies of government that separated the roles of different departments and gave them clearer authority and accountability. She reformed the system of taxation, which had been chaotic and medieval in its application, creating a more systematic and equitable structure, or at least more equitable by the standards of her time. The nobility, accustomed to centuries of exemption and privilege, resisted fiercely. But Maria Theresa had learned something that many monarchs never truly grasp, that the throne's power derives not from the nobility's consent, but from the strength of the state itself. And a strong state required money, organization, and the loyalty of common subjects. Education became one of her genuine passions, a domain where her reforms were both deep and surprisingly progressive for the era. She established new schools, encouraged the education of girls, a radical notion in some quarters, and worked to standardize curriculum across her far-flung territories. The idea, never explicitly stated but nonetheless present in her policies, was that a more educated population would be a more productive one, a more orderly one, and ultimately more useful to the state. It was efficiency masquerading as enlightenment, or perhaps enlightenment discovering that it served efficiency. The two were not in contradiction in her mind. The reforms extended into the military as well. The Habsburg armies of her father's time had been loosely coordinated, regionally based, often ineffective. She modernized their structure, established clearer hierarchies, improved training and discipline. She even created a kind of military academy, a place where officers could be taught the theoretical underpinnings of warfare rather than relying solely on experience and tradition. It was a transformation that would have implications far beyond her own reign, setting the stage for military innovations that would echo through the next century. There was also the matter of the Church, which in the fragmented landscape of Central Europe held a kind of power that was nearly equal to the secular authority. Maria Theresa was devoutly Catholic, genuinely, not as a mere matter of political convenience, but she was also willing to assert state authority over ecclesiastical affairs in ways that earlier monarchs had hesitated to do. She reformed the marriage laws, restructured the role of the Church in education, and established something approaching a boundary between religious and secular authority. These were delicate moves, requiring both conviction and political instinct. They offended many. They also worked. The social reforms, though more limited than the administrative ones, attempted to ameliorate some of the worst conditions of peasant life, particularly in the core Austrian territories. These were not born of humanitarian impulse alone, though one should not entirely discount her genuine concern for her subjects' welfare, but also from the practical understanding that an impoverished peasantry could not effectively serve the state's needs, could not provide soldiers, could not generate tax revenue. Still, the reforms happened. Conditions improved, if slowly. Children in certain regions were less likely to starve. That is not nothing, measured against the standard of the era. One might imagine her in those middle years of her reign, in her palaces, or travelling between them, gradually becoming more comfortable in a role that had initially felt like an armour worn by someone far too small for it. She was bearing children regularly. 16 of them would eventually survive to adulthood, a remarkable fertility that seemed almost designed by Providence to ensure the dynasty's continuation. She was making decisions about territories she had never visited, speaking languages she had learned in childhood and rarely heard spoken aloud, corresponding with advisors and generals and other monarchs in the intricate dance of 18th century politics. The empire she was attempting to modernize was itself a kind of ancient thing, assembled from fragments and inheritance rather than conquest. It stretched from the Low Countries to Transylvania, from the Baltic approaches down into Italy. It contained dozens of ethnic and linguistic groups, each with their own histories and grudges and loyalties. To rule such a territory was not to rule a nation in any modern sense, but to manage an elaborate system of negotiations and accommodations, each one balanced on the knife's edge of precedent and law and custom. The reforms that Maria Theresa enacted were not revolutionary in the manner that would come to characterize the latter part of the century. There was no sudden rupture with the past, no declaration of new principles that rejected the old entirely. Instead, there was a gradual, patient restructuring, a taking of medieval institutions and making them slightly more rational, slightly more efficient, slightly more responsive to the needs of a state that found itself competing with younger, hungrier powers. Prussia under Frederick the Great was more militarily innovative, more dramatically reform-minded in some ways. France was wealthier and more culturally dominant. But Austria, under Maria Theresa's careful stewardship, became more durable. The machinery of the state, while never perfectly smooth, functioned more predictably than it had before. It is worth pausing here to consider what this actually meant for the people who lived under these reforms. The peasants working fields in Bohemia or Moravia would have noticed subtle changes, perhaps a slightly different tax assessed, perhaps a school established in their village, perhaps a reduced burden on certain days owed to their local lord. The merchants and artisans in Vienna or Prague would have observed a state becoming more orderly, though also more intrusive, more interested in controlling the details of economic life. The nobility, particularly the older, more traditional families, would have felt a gradual erosion of privileges they had held for centuries, a subtle but unmistakable assertion of royal authority over feudal prerogative. Some adapted, some resisted. All were affected. The personal cost to Maria Theresa of maintaining this balancing act was not insignificant. She was a woman in an age when women wielded power either through the mediation of male relatives or through exceptional individual will. She chose the latter path and paid for it in the currency of constant vigilance, of being unable to truly relax her guard, of knowing that any sign of weakness or indecision would be seized upon by those waiting for the moment when a woman's nerve might falter. By most accounts, she became stronger as she aged, more confident in her authority, more willing to make difficult decisions. Her marriage to Francis Stephen remained cordial and produced many children, but by most evidence, it was not a love match in any romantic sense. It was a partnership, an arrangement that worked. She mothered her children, advised them, married them off to the various powers of Europe to create alliances. She also buried some of them. The losses accumulated, as they always do. By the time of her death in 1780, the empire she had received as a young woman threatened with dissolution had been stabilized, reformed, and positioned to endure for another century and a half. It would never again be the most powerful force in Europe. That distinction had passed to Prussia and France and would eventually go to others. But it would persist, functional and reasonably prosperous, a Central European power capable of defending itself and maintaining its territories. Much of what Maria Theresa built would be dismantled by her successors or would prove insufficient to the stresses of the next era. But the fact of the building itself, the fact that she attempted modernization at all, made her one of the more consequential monarchs in the Habsburg line. She inherited a dynasty in decline and left it, if not restored to its former dominance, at least no longer on the precipice of dissolution. That is perhaps the most that any ruler, working within the constraints of their era and their position, can truly accomplish. The great maps of Europe that hung in Habsburg palaces began to shrink during those years when Napoleon's armies moved across the continent like a force of nature, relentless and reimagining everything they touched. The empire that had endured for centuries, that had spread its influence through marriage and careful diplomacy, while others waged their brutal wars, found itself suddenly outmatched by a general who understood something the old dynasties were only beginning to learn, that the age of courtly negotiation was ending and the age of nations had arrived. And yet the Habsburgs, in their particular way, would not simply disappear into history as so many others did. Instead, they transformed, they adapted, they found a new shape for themselves in the ruins of what they had been. When Napoleon's armies first began their campaigns in the 1790s, Austria stood in opposition, as it had always done with threats to its order. The war that followed was not like the measured conflicts of previous centuries, conducted by professional soldiers on appointed fields far from the centers of power. This was something different. The revolutionary fervor that swept through France had become a kind of contagion, an ideology that made traditional borders and ancient claims of blood seem almost quaint. The Habsburgs found themselves defending not just territory, but the very principle of hereditary rule itself, and in that struggle they would be defeated again and again. Can you imagine the shock that must have reverberated through the gilded halls of Vienna when the French occupation came, the seat of imperial power, the ancient center of authority that had seemed as permanent as the Danube itself, found itself under foreign rule. Yet it was precisely in that moment of deepest humiliation that something curious happened, something that would shape the dynasty's survival for another century. The Habsburgs began to understand that they could not hold Europe together through the old methods anymore. The world had moved beyond them, and they would have to move with it, or cease to exist entirely. The Treaty of Westphalia, back in 1648, had already begun to transform the nature of the Holy Roman Empire, fragmenting its authority into countless principalities and states that looked increasingly toward Paris rather than Vienna for cultural and political direction. Now, at the turn of the 19th century, that fragmentation accelerated. The old structures of the medieval empire, that vast, loosely bound collection of territories, held together by the force of Habsburg personality and precedent, was formally dissolved when Francis II, who would become the first and only emperor of Austria, officially ended the Holy Roman Empire in 1806. There is something almost melancholy in imagining that moment, when he signed the document that ended 1,000 years of institutional continuity, when the last Holy Roman Emperor laid down a crown that had meant everything to his family's sense of purpose for so long. What replaced it was something both smaller and, in its way, more honest. The Austrian Empire, declared in 1804, was a nation-state in the modern sense, defined not by feudal relationships and ancient claims, but by the peoples and territories the Habsburgs actually controlled. It was a recognition, perhaps, that they could no longer pretend to rule Christendom. They could only rule Austria. But even that, in those Napoleonic years, seemed uncertain. After the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, after the Treaty of Pressburg that followed, the Austrian Empire lost territory after territory to its enemies. The Habsburgs were being diminished before their own eyes, forced to watch their sphere of influence contract year by year. And then came the final blow, or what seemed like the final blow at the time. In 1815, the Napoleonic Wars had ended, and Europe had to be remade entirely. At the Congress of Vienna, the great powers of Europe gathered, not to celebrate a Habsburg victory, there had been no Habsburg victory, but to prevent any single power, whether it was revolutionary France or ambitious Russia, from dominating the continent. The irony was profound, and perhaps not lost on those in Vienna's diplomatic circles. The Habsburgs, who had once ruled by marriage and gradual expansion, now had to accept a new kind of order, one in which they were merely one player among equals, though they remained essential to the balance. The settlement that emerged was deliberately conservative. It was designed to preserve monarchy, to suppress nationalism, to restore order and hierarchy after the chaos of the French wars. And in that conservative vision, Austria played a central role. Under Prince Metternich, who would become the great mind of this new European order, Vienna became something like the capital of conservative restoration. The Habsburgs, weakened militarily and territorially reduced, found a new kind of power through diplomacy, through the careful management of European affairs, through the prevention of change itself. It was a strange irony. The dynasty that had once expanded through marriage and strategic alliances now maintained its position by preventing others from doing exactly what they had done so successfully for centuries. But all of this happened against the background of forces that Metternich and his contemporaries only partially understood. Beneath the surface of the Congress of Vienna's neat arrangements, nationalism was growing. The very newspapers and intellectual movements that the conservative powers tried to suppress were becoming stronger, not weaker. People were beginning to think of themselves not as subjects of an empire, but as members of a nation. Germans were reading German literature and dreaming of German unity. Hungarians were recalling their ancient kingdom and imagining independence. Poles, Czechs, Romanians, South Slavs, all the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe were awakening to a new kind of consciousness, and this awakening, though it began quietly, would eventually shake the very foundations of the Austrian state. For decades, though, the Congress of Vienna's architecture held. The revolutions of 1848, which swept across Europe and threatened every throne, came closest to bringing down the Habsburg system entirely. But they were repressed, sometimes with brutal force, and the empire endured. Yet the experience of 1848 left its mark. The Habsburgs, for all their conservative principles, were forced to acknowledge that something had changed fundamentally. They could not simply restore the world that had existed before the French Revolution. They had to find a way to accommodate themselves to new realities while holding on to their power. This tension, this impossible balancing act between tradition and change, played out over the next 50 years in ways both tragic and surprisingly adaptive. The empire that had once been held together by the sheer weight of Habsburg tradition was becoming something far more fragile, a multinational state trying to hold together peoples of different languages, religions, and ambitions within a single political framework. How was this to be done? The answer, when it finally came, was neither obvious nor entirely satisfactory, but it had the virtue of extending the Habsburg rule for another 70 years. The transformation that occurred with the Compromise of 1867, the Ausgleich, as it was known in German, created the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This was not a smooth or joyful union. It was, in many ways, a reluctant compromise, born from the recognition that Hungary could not be ruled as it had been before, that the Hungarians possessed a kind of historical consciousness and national pride that had to be acknowledged. The Austrian Empire was reformed into a dual monarchy, with two separate states, Austria and Hungary, each with its own government and parliament, united only in the person of the monarch and in matters of foreign policy, defense, and finance. To imagine this from the perspective of those who lived through it is to understand a profound moment of transformation. The Habsburgs were no longer the undisputed rulers of a single empire, but rather the constitutional monarchs of two separate nations that shared a crown. It was a demotion of sorts, a recognition that the old model of absolute authority could no longer be sustained. Yet it was also, in its way, a triumph of survival. The Habsburgs had adapted themselves to new circumstances. They had yielded enough power to prevent revolution, while retaining enough authority to remain at the center of European affairs. The Austro-Hungarian Empire that emerged from this compromise would endure for another 50 years, presiding over one of the most culturally fertile periods in European history. Vienna became a city of extraordinary artistic and intellectual creativity, the place where Brahms composed symphonies and Sigmund Freud developed the theory of psychoanalysis, where the cafes hummed with philosophical debate and the concert halls filled nightly with the music of an empire in slow decline. Is there something peculiarly moving about cultural flowering in the twilight of power, about beauty and innovation emerging precisely in those moments when a world knows itself to be ending? The Austro-Hungarian Empire in the decades before the First World War possessed that quality, a kind of autumnal brilliance, the colors most vivid just before the leaves fall. But even this adaptation contained within it the seeds of future catastrophe. The problems that the Compromise of 1867 had papered over, the tensions between different nationalisms, the resentment of Slavic peoples who felt themselves dominated by both Germans and Hungarians, the economic inequalities that persisted despite political reform, these problems never truly went away. They merely waited, gathering strength beneath the surface, for their moment to explode into violence and chaos. The Habsburgs had managed to transform themselves, to find a new form that allowed them to endure into the 20th century. But they had not, and perhaps could not have, solved the fundamental problem that would eventually destroy them: how to rule a diverse collection of peoples in an age when peoples increasingly insisted on ruling themselves. That question would remain unanswered, waiting, like winter waits behind autumn, inevitable in its approach. The 19th century tilted toward its close, and with it came a figure whose presence would define not just an epoch, but the very meaning of endurance in an age of dissolution. Franz Joseph I ascended to the Austrian throne in 1848, the year revolutions erupted across Europe like a fever breaking in spring. He was 18 years old, his face already bearing the formal severity that would never leave it, his eyes holding the weight of a family determined to survive a world that no longer seemed to require emperors. He would reign for 68 years. 68 years is longer than a human lifetime for those born near the end of his rule. It is a reign that outlasted the American Civil War, the unification of Italy, the rise of Bismarck's Prussia, the birth of the industrial age, the first automobiles, the first airplanes. It is almost impossible to hold such a duration in the mind, and yet those 6 decades were not the triumphant arc of a monarch expanding his domain. They were something far more haunting, a slow, deliberate descent watched by the man himself with the clarity of one forced to witness his own obsolescence. The empire he inherited was already fragmenting, though the fragments had not yet begun their final scatter. The revolutions of 1848 had shaken the Austrian establishment to its foundations, and the young emperor's response was to clamp down, to hold tighter, to believe that order and ceremony, and the immovable tradition of the Habsburgs, could still anchor a world sliding toward modernity. He was, in many ways, a man of the previous century trying to rule the one that was arriving, and because he was intelligent, and because he was conscientious in a way that the Habsburg line sometimes forgot to be, he saw his methods failing even as he employed them. In his youth, there was still the possibility of love. At the age of 23, he met a young Bavarian duchess named Elizabeth, called Sisi by those close to her. She was 16, beautiful in a way that seemed to belong to poetry rather than politics. spirited in a manner that court life would slowly suffocate. They married, and for a brief, luminous moment, it seemed as though this austere emperor might find warmth in the personal sphere, if nowhere else. They had 4 children, 3 of whom would predecease him. The mathematics of grief accumulated slowly, then all at once. Their eldest son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, was a man of contradictions. Intellectually curious, modern in his thinking, trapped in a role that demanded he become his father. In 1889, at the age of 30, he died under circumstances that remain disputed. He was alone in his hunting lodge, and beside him lay the body of his young mistress, Marie Wetzera. Murder and suicide and accident blur together in the official records. The Habsburg establishment moved swiftly to contain the scandal. But scandal, once released, spreads like ink through water. Franz Joseph, who had already learned to live with regret, learned on that winter morning to live with inconsolable loss. The crown was now to pass to Rudolf's younger brother, then to his nephew Otto. The succession, which had seemed so stable, became a question mark, and Franz Joseph, who had spent his entire reign insisting on order, found that order could not protect against the randomness of death, or of sons choosing their own endings. Elizabeth drifted further from him after Rudolf's death, as though grief had become a corridor she needed to walk alone. She spent more time traveling, more time riding, more time away from the palace and the weight of ceremony. In 1898, while walking along the promenade in Geneva, she was stabbed by an anarchist who barely knew her name. He had chosen her almost at random, seeing only the elegant woman, not the empress, not the mother, not the person who had already suffered more privately than most people bear in a lifetime. She was 60, still beautiful, still restless. Franz Joseph received the news while at work, as he always was. He was 76 years old. He wept, but only in private. The next day, he held court as though nothing had changed. This was perhaps the most Habsburg response of all, the belief that the continuance of routine could somehow contain the enormity of loss. His remaining years became a kind of vigil. He continued to rise at 5 in the morning, to work through his correspondence with meticulous attention, to receive visitors and maintain the rituals that held the empire together through sheer ceremonial force. But the world was moving without him. Industrial power was shifting. Nationalism was rising, particularly in the Balkans, where Ottoman decline created a vacuum that Russia and Austria-Hungary both reached toward. The Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, which Maximilian had crafted as a way to preserve power in a changing age, began to seem more fragile with each passing decade. There was a daughter, Valerie, who stayed with him in his later years, unmarried by choice, dedicating herself to her aging father. There was loyalty, and there was love, but there was also, one imagines, a kind of weariness that comes from watching someone you adore persist in a role that the world has outgrown. He lived to be 86 years old, which was remarkable for a man of his era. He lived long enough to see the 20th century arrive, long enough to know that the old certainties were dissolving, long enough to feel the tremors of what would become the First World War. He lived long enough to know that his world was ending, even if the official ending would come only after he was gone. In his final years, there was an almost tragic dignity to him. His face, which had always been stern, became a map of sorrow. The formality that had sustained him became also perhaps a kind of mercy, a structure to cling to when the substance beneath it was coming undone. He represented, in his very person, a dynasty refusing to accept its own decline, a man holding the line against entropy itself, knowing it was a losing battle, but fighting it anyway because that was what emperors did. When he died in 1916, during the war that was tearing Europe apart, the empire he left behind was already a ghost. It would take a few more years for the ghost to dissipate entirely, for the Austro-Hungarian sphere to break into its constituent nations, for the 6 centuries of Habsburg rule to finally yield to the new world that had been arriving all along. And so we arrive at the threshold where an empire, exhausted from centuries of holding itself together through ceremony and tradition and the slow accumulation of ancestral weight, finally released its grip. The Habsburg line that had wound itself through the tapestry of European history for 600 years found itself in a kind of terrible clarity when the guns fell silent in November of 1918. There was no dramatic last stand, no final battle where the dynasty made its last defiant gesture. Instead, there was a kind of quiet dissolution, a slow opening of fingers that could no longer hold what had been slipping away for generations. The empire that Charles V had once ruled from Spain to Bohemia, that Maria Theresa had desperately tried to reform and preserve, that Franz Joseph had watched dissolve piece by piece through his long and sorrowful reign, this empire simply ended, not in triumph or tragedy written in blood, but in a series of bureaucratic afternoons and hastily written documents. The last emperor was named Charles, and he carried the weight of that name across 6 centuries of precedent. He was only 29 years old when the weight became unbearable. Charles I, as he was known in Austria and Hungary, had inherited a throne in 1916 at a moment when the war was already consuming the resources of an empire that could no longer afford to wage it. He was a gentleman by the accounts of those who knew him, caught in a role designed for someone far stronger or far more ruthless. The conflict that he inherited was not of his making, but it was his to manage, and manage it he could not. The empire bled soldiers into the trenches of the Eastern Front, watched its cities grow hungry, felt its peoples, Czechs and Poles and Slovaks and Romanians and Croats, begin to whisper, then speak openly, then shout about their own nations, their own futures. By the autumn of 1918, as the German collapse made clear that the entire Central European order would fall, Charles found himself abandoned even by his own dynasty. His generals no longer obeyed him with certainty. His peoples were dissolving into nationalism. The very concept of a multi-ethnic empire ruled from Vienna began to seem not just obsolete but impossible, as if history itself had decided that such a thing could not exist anymore. And so on November 11th, 1918, just as the armistice was being signed in a railway carriage in France, Charles issued what would later be called the October Manifesto. Though it came in November, another small indignity of timing that seemed to characterize the very end of Habsburg rule. The manifesto promised autonomy to the various peoples of the empire, but it was already too late. The words had been written when the structure they were meant to preserve had already crumbled into dust. Czechoslovakia declared itself independent that very day. Poles proclaimed their nation. Romanians claimed Transylvania. Hungary severed itself. In the space of hours, the empire that had taken centuries to assemble came apart like a child's construction of blocks, each piece pulled away by hands, eager to build something new, something that belonged to a people rather than to a dynasty. Charles, watching this dissolution from the Schönbrunn Palace, understood finally what his predecessor had never fully grasped, that the age of empires held together by blood and habit, and the sheer accumulated weight of tradition, was ending. The 20th century would have no patience for such things. It demanded nations built on the consent of the governed, on shared language and ethnicity and will, not on the accident of birth into a family whose marriage alliances had once seemed so clever. What Frederick III had understood about marriage, what Maximilian had turned into an art form, what Maria Theresa had fought to preserve through force of personality, all of it meant nothing now. And so in early November, as the crowds grew restless in Vienna, and the soldiers began to desert their units and return home looking for food and meaning, Charles made the decision. He would not sign the abdication formally at first. He issued instead what was called the Proclamation, a strange middle ground of retreat that acknowledged that he could no longer rule. It was the Habsburg way to the very end, not quite a clear break, but a kind of slow stepping back into shadow. On November 12th, the day after the armistice, he left Vienna, not in exile yet, not formally cast out, but withdrawing, relinquishing, dissolving his claim to the world. He took his wife Zita with him, the woman who had entered the dynasty through marriage as so many had done before, and together they moved to a small castle in the Tyrol, waiting to see what would happen next. The new governments that sprang up in Vienna and Budapest had no use for a Habsburg. Austria, suddenly reduced to a small landlocked nation of just 7 million people, could not afford the symbolism of a monarchy. A republic was declared, the imperial crypt, where generations of Habsburgs had been laid to rest with ceremony and incense and the weight of history, would receive no more emperors. The furniture from the imperial palaces was auctioned off. The crown jewels were locked away. The Spanish riding school, that temple to Habsburg pageantry and discipline, continued, but without an emperor to watch the white stallions perform. Charles and his family lived in exile in Switzerland, then later in Madeira, a small Portuguese island in the Atlantic where he died in 1922, just 4 years after leaving Vienna. He was only 34 years old. His wife outlived him by decades, carrying with her the memory of a world that had vanished, receding into history with each passing year. The children he left behind would scatter across Europe, many of them marrying into other noble families, becoming footnotes to their own ancestral glory. The direct line of succession, which had seemed so carefully managed through those centuries of dynastic marriage, now led nowhere. There was no throne to inherit, no empire to rule, no reason for the world to remember that you were a Habsburg except for the archives and the historians, and the descendants who carried the name as a kind of private curiosity. The dispersal happened slowly at first, then all at once. Some Habsburgs remained in Austria, trying to live quietly. Others moved to France or Germany or Italy. A few drifted to South America or North Africa, to places where they hoped the name might mean something different, or better yet, nothing at all. They married into merchant families and academic circles and even, in some cases, into the very republics that had replaced their empire. The genetic line that had twisted and turned back on itself through centuries of strategic marriage, that had produced emperors and saints and the strange, haunted beauty of the Habsburg jaw, now simply became ordinary. They became doctors and artists and businessmen. They changed their names sometimes, shed the prefix von and the architectural weight of centuries of expectation. What had once been a dynasty that married rather than fought, that believed in the patient, careful accumulation of territory and power through the calculated union of man and woman, found that such patience meant nothing in the age of nations and ideology and peoples who wanted to determine their own future. The world that the Habsburgs had created and inhabited, the world of courts and ceremonies and the slow pageantry of empire, simply ceased to exist. It did not fade away over generations. It ended in the space of a few weeks, leaving behind only palaces that would become museums, only archives full of paper and ink, only the memory of something vast that had seemed permanent but turned out to be terribly, irreversibly fragile. And so the great house fell silent. The Kapuziner Gruft beneath Vienna's streets holds a silence that seems to have accumulated over centuries, layered beneath the city like the sediment of time itself. Stone upon stone, vault upon vault, the imperial crypt rests in the chapel of the Capuchin Church, and here, in the dimness broken only by the careful work of restoration crews and the occasional visiting scholar, 600 years of dynasty have been laid to rest. The air is cool and still, carrying the faint mineral scent of underground stone and the almost imperceptible perfume of time, dust that has settled so completely it becomes invisible to breath, to disturbance, to anything that might suggest the world above still moves and changes and forgets. To walk these passages is to move backward through centuries, to encounter the emperors and empresses in their final stillness. The great lead coffins stand, with their names engraved in careful script, some weathered smooth by age, others polished by the hands of those who come to remember. Maria Theresa lies here, her monument adorned with the symbols of her authority and the tokens of her long reign. Franz Joseph rests nearby, and around them all the smaller, quieter tombs of infants and heirs who did not live to rule, who died in fevers or childbirths, or the simple accidents of being born into a world that offered no mercy to the vulnerable, no matter how noble their blood. What strikes the visitor most, perhaps, is not the grandeur of the monuments, though they are elaborate and grand, but rather a kind of ordinariness that accompanies them. These are not gods laid to rest, but men and women who wanted their names remembered, who understood, perhaps with a clarity born of facing their own mortality, that a name carved in stone might be the only permanence available to any of us. The Habsburg jaw, so prominent in life, so carefully rendered in marble and bronze, becomes here simply the features of the dead. The weight of empire, the endless protocols, the marriages that bound continents together, all of it dissolves in the presence of stone and shadow and the patient work of dissolution that time performs on all authority. There is a particular melancholy in the artifacts of power when that power has ended. The orb and scepter, the coronets that sit atop the tombs, the faded silk cushions and ceremonial decorations, they speak of a world that believed itself eternal, that assumed its structures would continue to the end of time itself, and yet here they rest in darkness, their authority absolute only over the marble around them. When Rudolf I first claimed his throne in 1273, could he have imagined that his family would rule for 6 centuries, or did he assume, as all men do, that his reign was merely the beginning of something that would extend forever into an unmeasured future? The history of the Habsburgs, surveyed from this vantage point of their final rest, begins to seem less like a story of domination and more like a meditation on the nature of duration itself. How does a family persist across such vast stretches of time? Not through the strength of individual rulers, though there were strong rulers, not through the invulnerability of their position, though they held their ground against empires that rose around them, but rather through a kind of stubborn endurance, a willingness to adapt and reform, to merge with the territories they controlled, until it became impossible to say where Austria ended and the Habsburgs began. They were not an external force imposed upon Europe, but rather woven into its fabric so thoroughly that their absence, when finally it came, left not a wound, but a strange absence, like a thread pulled from tapestry. The whole thing does not unravel, but something irreplaceable has been removed. The Spanish branch, glittering and tragic, burned out in a single generation of severe consanguinity. The Austrian line endured, though it too eventually bent and broke beneath the weight of the 20th century's wars and revolutions. And here in this crypt, both lines converge in the finality of marble and memory. A crown jewel glimmers in a nearby chamber, preserved and labelled, waiting for no one. The imperial regalia sits in its cases, as though it might still be needed someday, though everyone who enters knows that the world it was designed for has passed away utterly. Perhaps the deepest legacy of the Habsburgs is not the territories they controlled or the wars they prevented through strategic marriage, but rather what they teach us about the fragility of institutions that seem permanent. A dynasty that ruled through 6 centuries comes to seem, in retrospect, almost tentative, each generation succeeded by a thin margin of luck and careful calculation. Each marriage was a gamble, each heir was a risk. The careful arithmetic of genealogy, the close calculation of who might marry whom to preserve territorial holdings and consolidate power, All of it was ultimately unable to preserve the dynasty itself from the currents of history that washed over Europe in the 20th century. And yet Vienna herself remembers them. The buildings they commissioned still stand, subtly altering the light that falls on the city's squares. The streets they walked still exist, carrying names like Mikkelerplatz and Herrengasse, and those who move through these streets today are moving through the spaces that the Habsburgs once inhabited, so that there is still a kind of presence, a lingering trace of their passage through time. The Schönbrunn Palace, vast and golden in certain lights, still contains the essence of Maria Theresa's world, still speaks in its decoration and proportion of the confidence and grandeur of an earlier age. What remains, then, when power passes away? Certainly not the authority itself, certainly not the fear that once attended the imperial name. But something does remain, and it is harder to define. It is the trace of human ambition and suffering intertwined, the evidence that people once stood in these rooms and made decisions that rippled across continents. It is the physical reminder that beauty can be created in service of power and will outlast the power itself. It is the knowledge that a child born into a dynasty might never have chosen the life of a ruler, yet carried out the role because it had been assigned to them at birth, and because the structures around them were too solid, too ancient, too massive to resist. The imperial crypt falls deeper into shadow as evening approaches. The last visitors have ascended the stone stairs to the living city above. The candles have been tended by those whose responsibility it is to maintain the memory of the dead. And in this quiet, something speaks softly about the nature of legacy itself. A dynasty passes away, an empire dissolves, and yet the desire to persist, to be remembered, to leave something behind that will outlast the body, that remains unchanged in us, as it remained unchanged in Rudolf and Maria Theresa and all the others who lie in this place. The names are preserved, the story is preserved, and perhaps that, after all, was what they wanted most of all, not to rule forever, but to be remembered as having ruled, to know that their names would be spoken and their stories told long after the thrones they sat upon had been moved to museums, and the borders they drew had been redrawn by others. In this dark and quiet place, their wish was granted. They are remembered. The memory rests here, cool and patient, waiting for whoever might come next to wonder at the complexity of human striving and the strange permanence of impermanence itself.